All right, everybody, we're going to get started with our afternoon panel. Welcome back. I hope the lunch was good. I'm Sean Smith. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy in the UH department here, and I convened this panel. It's called Healing from the Trauma of Conditioned Existence. So we're going to talk about some classical Indian philosophy and their conception of how awful life can be. It's going to be a really uplifting session. To start, we're going to have my good friend and colleague, Kat Pruitt, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, give us a paper on the collective agent of suffering. Let's welcome Kat.
Communal suffering often seems to be more than the sum of its parts. Intergenerational trauma, suffering caused by environmental degradation, the crushing sorrow of seeing a homeland destroyed, none of these are reducible simply to adding up individual suffering. Rather, there seems to be something about collective suffering that defines a community at its roots. Conversely, this something may also reach down to support a community through transformative joy in response to trauma. How can we possibly account for the complexity of moments when a community, faced with intense pain, becomes defined by a complex mix of suffering and joy? I am in no way foolish or audacious enough to propose an answer to this question. What I'd like to do today is to get some tools on the table that might help us reframe how we think about both pain and about agency. I developed these tools by engaging with two rather disparate traditions: a particular stream of contemporary analytic philosophy of pain that argues that the content of pain is imperative rather than descriptive, and the understanding of pain as the movement that occurs at the boundaries of agential integration in the Pratyabhijna Shaiva philosophical tradition of medieval Kashmir. In the end, I suggest that pain is an allostatic imperative to adapt an aspect of an embodied world in response to a perceived threat to bodily stability. We'll see, I hope, how adopting these tools allow us to account for the fluidity of agents operating at different scales and the constitutive role of pain in fixing the division between self and other. I'll also suggest that the proper range of affect that accompanies pain includes not just suffering, but all of the affects that go along with the recognition of an agent's responsibility of self-authorship within the constraints of an agent's embodied world. So we're going to start with pain. To get a handle on what we're talking about, I'll begin by discussing what is the simplest, but still hardly well understood, type of pain: individual bodily pain. Recent work in analytic philosophy of pain argues that pains are commands from one's body, having contents of a specific sort. Manolo Martinez glosses this content as a negated existential. See to it that bodily damage D does not exist. While Colin Klein claims that the content of pain is a homeostatic command to protect a part of one's body. For many pains, these claims are plausible, but there are others, such as an ache in one's neck, that demand bodily responses such as stretching. My claim here is that pains such as these are indeed imperatives, but their content differs from what Klein and Martinez propose. If the command issued by the body in these cases were to stop bodily damage, or to protect a body part, then it would seem that the intensifying of the pain that occurs when one stretches should command one to stop that bodily damage more urgently, or to protect that part more assiduously, and so stop the stretch. But the person who stretches their aching neck may take the intensifying of the ache as telling them to hold the stretch, or even lean into it more, because if one retreats from the stretch too quickly, the pain remains unsatisfied. It is only by carefully maintaining the right tension, and thereby cultivating the pain correctly, that the problematic muscles are able to refashion themselves in a way that answers the body's command. The pain does not dissipate because one protectively or homeostatically backs off, but because one pushes to transform how one's body was. Such a case cannot be accounted for if pain is taken to be a command of the precise sort that contemporary pain imperativists argue. For Martinez, it's unclear precisely what the bodily damage would be that stretching is commanding one to remove. A pain issued in relation to a muscle that is actually damaged, say a torn muscle, would be made worse by stretching, rather than being satisfied by stretching. If there is ever a case where stretching directly satisfies a pain, I will argue below that there is, then a command to stop bodily damage cannot be the generic form of pain's imperatival content. Klein's suggestion, which takes the imperatival content of pain to be protective, struggles with stretching because it misses the fact that it is also possible to satisfy a painful bodily command by making a positive anticipatory change, rather than by protecting the body part. Homeostatic imperativism about pain is therefore too narrow. Building on Klein's framework, I argue that pain should be understood as an allostatic command, for in pain, the body may command not only protection, but also transformation. Allostasis is the process by which an organism preserves stability through change, in a way that requires both the ability to transform and the ability to protect itself. Adaptation, as I will use the term, refers to the process by which our bodies instantiate themselves in the world moment by moment. Maintaining one's form of embodiment is itself adaptive because one's body and one's worlds are both changing constantly, with the result that one must continuously and creatively act in anticipation of new moods and circumstances. This adaptation is an allostatic process. I will argue that, as an allostatic command to adapt a part of one's body, pain serves to focus the body's creative activity on a particular part that is under threat. So I'm going to clarify some key terms here. Homeostasis, allostasis, heterostasis, and bodily boundary. So the first of these, homeostasis, is familiar, and it has an established place in the existing literature on pain. Klein derives his understanding of homeostasis from Walter Cannon, who coined the term to refer to the process by which living organisms maintain certain vital physiological markers at relatively steady states. Citing Cannon as his authority, Klein summarizes his understanding of homeostasis along these lines. Life exists on a thin margin, he says. Survival requires many physiological variables to be kept stable within a narrow range. As neither we nor the environment are static, our bodies must constantly adjust to changing conditions. Homeostasis is the collective name for processes that maintain this balance. Homeostasis, then, is the process of maintaining stability through constancy, the error-correcting process by which living organisms maintain life by protecting their internal milieu against too radical deviations from vital set points. However, whether or not homeostasis can account for the full range of vital self-regulating processes that organisms display in their environments remains a topic of significant debate. Peter Sterling and Joseph Ayer coined the idea of allostasis in response to their observation that data on how vital physiological markers vary depending on a number of environmental and behavioral factors poorly fits the idea that organisms strive to maintain a constant internal milieu. They contend that an expanded principle is needed to capture the vital role of anticipatory changes in the parameters of an organism's internal milieu. Although allostasis has since been, and so they refer to this principle as allostasis, meaning stability through change. Although allostasis has since been developed in a number of directions, this broad framework of self-regulating biological processes aimed at stability through change remains central to allostatic frameworks. The idea that self-regulating processes are both anticipatory and error-corrective has fueled the most promising developments of allostatic paradigms. It resonates with Hans Selye's early contention that what he terms heterostatic responses exist alongside of homeostatic ones. In his early landmark study of stress, Selye observes, natural homeostatic mechanisms are usually sufficient to maintain a normal state of resistance. When faced with unusually heavy demands, however, ordinary homeostasis is not enough. Selye coins the term heterostasis to refer to the establishment of a new steady state, and notes that in both homeostasis and heterostasis, the milieu interior participates actively. As a broad base of empirical studies have demonstrated, the interplay between corrective and anticipatory processes allows an organism to dynamically adjust itself to the continuously changing conditions of its environment, both external and internal, thereby conferring significant evolutionary advantages so long as the organism is able to move fluently between normal and heightened states. My claim that pain is an allostatic imperative builds on these lines that sees allostasis as the process by which an organism achieves internal viability through bodily change of state. Along with Shulkin and Sterling, I emphasize that allostasis does not exclude homeostasis. Along with Selye, I emphasize the importance of theorizing heterostatic responses working alongside homeostatic ones. So for clarity and understanding the imperative content of pain, I stipulate that allostasis shall refer to the adaptive process of maintaining stability through change, which includes both error-corrective or homeostatic and anticipatory or heterostatic processes. Homeostatic processes aim to protect the organism by returning to a previous steady state, Heterostatic processes aim to transform the organism by anticipating a new steady state. On this understanding, allostasis is a broader category that encompasses both homeostasis and heterostasis as subcategories. An allostatic command is a command issued by the body with respect to an allostatic sensation. Here, the body refers to the entire psychophysically embodied complex that is a living being. It is neither reducible to nor exclusive of the brain or mind. Pain is an allostatic command to adapt a part of one's body, where to adapt a part of one's body means to stabilize a body part felt to be under threat, either through protecting or through transforming the relevant bodily boundary. This brings up our last piece of terminology. Although pain is the body's command to create a part of itself, the body issues the command through its own sense of what the relevant part is. I will refer to this sense as a bodily boundary. By and large, one body's boundaries will closely correspond to the physical instantiations of one's body parts, but this isn't always the case. For instance, someone with phantom limb syndrome would experience a bodily boundary concerning the missing limb, even though the limb doesn't physically exist. A bodily boundary can be provisionally thought of, for instance, as a part of a body schema or map, or as a concept that is an interoceptive embodied simulation of a specific bodily region within the brain's internal model, and so on, according to one's theoretical orientation. My discussion of pains being issued in relation to bodily boundaries remains open to a number of ways of specifying this point. The important thing about bodily boundaries is that they are the internal parameters according to which living beings instantiate themselves in their worlds, where by instantiate I mean set and continue to inhabit bodily boundaries that the living being experiences as stable. Bodily boundaries are the dividing line between what we take to be integrated into our own bodily agency and what we take to be external to ourselves. Protective and transformative alterations of bodily boundaries both fall under the umbrella of adaptation and so of allostasis. This picture of pain as an allostatic imperative departs from and builds upon current pain imperativism, which, as we've mentioned, understands the body's command as homeostatic, where homeostasis is identified with protective processes only. Klein, for instance, argues that pains are imperatives to protect a part of your body. Pain for Klein is a conditional standing protective imperative because it commands an organism to protect a certain body part in a certain way with a certain intensity and until explicitly canceled, with multiple satisfaction conditions ranked across possible worlds. The command is issued by the body as a whole, but the felt location of a pain corresponds to the body part that the command concerns. If the body understands itself to have some part, then it can issue a command in relation to that part, regardless of whether or not the part exists. A command does not have to be satisfiable in order to be issued. Phenomena such as phantom limb pain indicate that there is no straightforward way to map the occurrence of a pain onto a physical body part. One of the great strengths of this framework is how it articulates the relationship between pain as a command and the variable affects that may or may not accompany this command. It's possible to have all kinds of affective responses to a command, and pain is no exception. This provides a robust frame for understanding the well-attested distinction between pain sensation and pain affect, that is, the distinction between the sensory input associated with pain and an individual's affective evaluation of this input. Following this distinction, Klein emphasizes that his primary imperativism is an account of pain, not of painfulness or suffering. Pains do not need affective badness to motivate. Instead, they motivate directly, as commands issued by a source whose authority one accepts. The acceptance depends on accepting that bodily integrity should be maintained. An agent who completely disregards their body's authority would stop being motivated by pain entirely. For one who partially disregards their body's authority, the pain may still be present as an open, nagging command that they are aware of not satisfying even as other concerns take precedence. Klein further links the dampening of pain's motivational force to pervasive forms of depersonalization, since accepting the body's command depends on taking that command to be directed at me. He theorizes that this depersonalization may also account for why individuals with pain asymbolia are not bothered by pain, in addition to being unmotivated by it. He notes that depersonalization is common to some other instances of pain where pain and suffering come apart, such as in some psychiatric disorders and in the case of morphine pain. Klein sees the danger of dissolving one's sense of self as placing a limit on the degree to which pain and suffering can truly come apart. Although as he says, although suffering can be reduced considerably, it probably cannot be eliminated without also eliminating important facts about agency and care. For Klein, maintaining the historical integrity of the self remains an unquestioned imperative. But what if caring about the body in the right way doesn't always involve maintaining homeostasis? And what if suffering isn't the only affect that properly accompanies pain? Although Klein does not seem to seriously consider these questions, they arise naturally within an imperative theory of pain. Klein's assumption that the authority of the body will command self-preservation seems to follow from the basic intuition that what life in the universe wants is to survive, and survival is most directly facilitated by protective action. This is a quite reasonable theory that neatly encapsulates the homeostatic view of self-regulation, but it's still possible to question whether or not it tells the whole story. I suggest that the critiques posed by theorists advancing the idea of allostasis against the homeostatic paradigm's focus on error correction as maintaining a steady state apply here too. If there are times when one satisfies the body's command by transforming rather than protecting one's boundaries, then Klein's protective imperativism is incomplete. I argue that the stretching case is such an instance, and that this mundane example points to the prevalence of transformative responses to pain. So I'm going to focus on pain that motivates and accompanies stretching as a routine example of an allostatic command whose optimal satisfaction condition involves the heterostatic establishment of a new bodily boundary. So here's the case. Asami is in a yoga class. Her left hamstring feels particularly tight. She bends her right knee and raises her left hip, intensifying the pain sensation that she initially feels across the back of her left knee as she tries to straighten it. Slowly and deliberately, attending closely to the shifts in the pain, she pedals her feet in order to deepen the stretch. The pain spreads from a hard knot behind her left knee up and down her leg. Once this full stretch is activated, she pauses, holds the edge, and breathes, while attempting to straighten her knee a bit more and extend from her lower back. The pain is quite intense. She continues to breathe into it and visualizes her knee straight. There's a softening, and her knee moves a bit more to a new edge. Here too, she holds, breathes, softens. She feels a release as her muscles come into line with the new form she's visualized. She exhales and fully extends her knee for the first time in this position. The pain remains for a moment as she holds this new edge, and then releases as the new boundary stabilizes. She feels a delighted satisfaction, and as the class continues, she finds herself able to move her leg in new ways, holding and strengthening different positions that reinforce her sense that she has developed new capacities for movement that accord more closely with the demands she places upon her body and the world. That's the example. This example is designed to set the context, motivation, process, and end result of the stretch in as clear a way as possible. While my sense is that most, if not all, cases of stretching motivated by pain are ideally satisfied by a heterostatic response, such as Asami's, there may be some cases where stretching is properly homeostatic. In particular, stretching in response to an acute muscle spasm might be error corrective. However, if Asami's case is plausible, then we have an instance where stretching directly satisfies pain through realigning a body part in line with anticipated future needs. If that's true, then a heterostatic response satisfies pain, which means that pain's command is allostatic, not just homeostatic. Klein's own brief mention of stretching comes in the context of differentiating between primary and secondary motivational forces. Briefly, for Klein, primary motivational force is that which stems from the intrinsic properties of pain. Secondary motivation, by contrast, includes all motivational states that are properly extrinsic to pain. This includes any mental states that are caused by or directed toward the sensation of pain. Note that the goals of the two motivational states, note the different goals of the two motivational states. The later motivates me to protect a part of my body, where the former motivates actions that will have an effect on one of my sensations, as he says. So Klein treats stretching as a secondary response, taking it to be an action that is mediated by the knowledge that stretching will eventually, but not directly, remove the feeling of pain, so that stretching is, one, dependent on background knowledge in the same kind of way that, for instance, taking ibuprofen to rid oneself of a headache would be, and two, addresses the sensation of pain, not the body part involved. I contend that both of these claims misrepresent the phenomenology of stretching, and that stretching is properly a primary response to pain. The most direct response to the type of pain issued in relation to an excessively tight muscle is to stretch it. Okay, so then I'm going to skip a little bit of the argument for that, but ask me about it if you want to. So, in Asami's case, to talk again about the phenomenology here a bit, the pain was satisfied and therefore stopped only once she had managed to realign the problematic body part in a way that she recognized as stable. The focus throughout this process was precisely on the body part, with the pain guiding Asami in anticipation of a new way to instantiate the problematic part, and the stretching responding directly to pain's command. Properly performing a stretch is a matter of being guided by the body to produce the optimal level of pain in the right place, so that the body part in question can be stabilized through the anticipation of a new bodily boundary that accords with the felt capacities of the part in question. Asami's resultant delight upon realizing a new bodily boundary is also consistent with the heterostatic response providing a proper satisfaction condition for pain's command. As Asami stretches, she's focused, clear, and highly attuned to her goal. In the moment of attuning to the pain, Asami is locked within a single-minded clarity on just that command. This attunement includes the motivational force of the pain and the push to transform. In staying motivated by the pain, Asami also maintains her acceptance of the body's authority. Remember that denying the body's authority would vacate the motivational impact of the pain. But even as Asami feels motivated by the pain and so accepts the body, she's affirming her push to transform. If stretching were to be contrary to the primary motivational force of pain, Asami should feel here as if she were disobeying her body's command by stretching. But she doesn't. There's nothing in the phenomenology of Asami's particular case to indicate that her body is commanding her to protect her leg by keeping it still, as Klein would have it. She doesn't feel the satisfaction of her body transformed through pain in spite of her body, but as her body, as the forward-looking form that she has created for herself. All right, so it is central to the allostatic picture that organisms thrive by having the flexibility to anticipate new steady states in addition to being able to correct for errors. My contention that pain contributes to this flexibility by motivating responses that may be transformative rather than only protective. The picture therefore disagrees with Patrick Wall's account of what pains motivate. As Klein explains, on Wall's story, pains motivate actions that will remove the threat that caused them. Pains limit motion by motivating you not to move. If you avoid moving, you heal. The less you move, the faster you heal. However, it's not always the case, even for the pains of recovery on which Klein focuses, that the less you move, the faster you heal. If this were true, then physiotherapy would always make injuries worse. Although there certainly are times when an injured body part needs to be protected by being kept still, there are also times when movement is imperative because the injured body part needs to be guided to a new form. Depending on the situation, either protection or transformation may be appropriate responses to pain. Protective responses also may not always be possible. Take, for instance, chronic pain. This could be a case where a protective response is not available because there's no stable previous instantiation of the body part available for return. Physiotherapy, which generally proceeds by intentionally breaking down dysfunctional parts of one's body while building up new strengths and patterns, is an appropriate response to chronic pain because physiotherapy aims to create a new stable form for the target body part. The fact that physiotherapy itself causes pain poses no puzzle here, since in physiotherapy one is realigning the body part so that it may break out of the maladaptive form within which it was stuck. It's also not puzzling on this picture why painkillers provide at best only temporary relief from pain, and have limited efficacy with chronic pain in particular. When the painkiller wears off, one remains in one's previous position of instability. Since the onset of pain means that one has already moved beyond the previously stable condition of the relevant body part, a protective response is still a change in one's current condition, even if that change tries to reinstantiate the way that one's body part was before the onset of pain. You might, for instance, protect your hand by pulling it out of a fire. What you're doing here is moving from a situation where the integrity of your body part is threatened to one where it's no longer threatened by reverting to a previously stable set of conditions. In this case, simply by changing the physical position of the body part in relation to the external threat. This is still a change, but the change is error corrective in that it's in service of trying to reinstantiate the previous stable condition of the body part in the world. Likewise, transformation doesn't entail a complete break from how things were. Rather, transformation adapts the relevant body part in the sense that the anticipatory boundary that one projects and realizes is not the same as a boundary that one understands oneself to have previously inhabited. Both types of responses are in service precisely of the allostatic goal of maintaining stability through change. This is why I see both protective and transformative responses as being equally possible ways for allostatic adaptation to be realized. So then the homeostatic imperative understanding of pain is too narrow. But what is it that sets the bounds on what constitutes pain? I turn now to the Pratyabhijna Shaiva understanding of pain to precify the domain that pain's command concerns. Pain occurs during the activity of a gentle integration as one stabilizes parts of one body felt to be under threat by excluding from one's own sense of bodily ownership what one takes to be other than oneself. At the beginning of the final section of his verses on the recognition of the Lord, Upaladeva summarizes the process by which embodied subjects constitute themselves in their worlds. This process is driven by exclusion, apoha, in that the boundary of what an agent takes to be integrated into itself is constituted by carving out a counterpart in the form of an object against which the newly determinate subject defines itself. In this context, Upaladeva equates pain, dukkha, with action, kriya, in the sense that pain characterizes the principle of activity, rajas, that straddles the line between what is agentially incorporated into oneself and what is set apart. As Upaladeva concludes, for a limited individual, the term rajas designates pain and action. In the course of clarifying earlier parts of this section, Abhinavagupta glosses the kind of movement that pain instantiates with the term chanchalya, an evocative word meaning unsteadiness or quick rolling motion that reflects the foundational Samkhya understanding of rajas as trembling movement, chala. As Abhinava comments, for rajas is referred to as pain, which has the nature of unsteadiness that encompasses awareness and non-awareness. The point here is that rajas holds in tension both sentience and insentience as a living being navigates instantiating their boundaries in the world. And this is what spurs the unsteadiness with regard to bodily boundaries, that is, pain. This instability of bodily boundaries gives rise to the desire to find rest, to stabilize oneself by taking determinate form. Abhinavagupta again brings together pain, unsteadiness, and rajas in one of his works on aesthetics, as he says, and pain is defined simply as the absence of rest. This is why the followers of Kapila, the Samkhyans, have described the essence of the activity of rajas precisely as the unsteadiness of pain. The rest that Abhinava references here is the experience of fullness that forms the backdrop against which all other experiences manifest. For Abhinavagupta, any account of human experience must be rich enough to encompass both our mundane judgments, this is a pot, that's a cloth, I'm myself, you are another, and the moments when our limited sense of self drops away as we rest in relishing shared forms of emotion in an aesthetic encounter. Abhinavagupta sees the unsteadiness that characterizes pain as an invitation to refashion our boundaries by skillfully navigating the process by which we take ourselves to stand in fixed relations to the world. Notably, and we will return to this later, individual human agency is far from the only level at which this process may find rest. An exchange that Abhinava writes himself with an opponent focuses on pain as an example of an experience that the opponent claims utterly lacks the joy that characterizes the freedom to create oneself. Here is the exchange. An objection. When perceiving pain, the I indeed is present, but in that case there is no joy that has the nature of wonder. Abhinava's reply. Who says that there isn't? Indeed, this I that is being relished rests even within pain. But one who is intent on an external object, who is searching for something that will only disappoint, will not notice this internal rest because it is concealed by a lack of attention. However, in the view of our particular teachings, when illusion has dissolved in that one no longer focuses on an external form, precisely this resting is revealed. Thus, Somananda's vision of Shiva says, even in the midst of pain, because of the expansion of consciousness, there is joy in the painful object. Pain need not be experienced as suffering. The presence of pain points to the freedom to create one's own boundaries. For Abhinavagupta, the ultimate experience of freedom is simply one's ability to rest in the joy of creativity itself. But this creativity expresses itself as taking determinate forms, and the maintenance of these forms for the one who recognizes that their instantiation in a world is itself a creative act can be equally joyful. The distinction between pain being experienced as joy or pain being experienced as suffering, then, tracks the extent to which one experiences oneself as freely able to author one's own boundaries as one desires, or not. This picture of pain as the instability that spurs bodily self-creation makes visible both the proper domain of pain and the full range of conditions available to satisfy the body's command. For Pratibhijna thinkers, as for many other classical Sanskrit philosophers, there is a tight link between pain and embodiment itself. In a minimal sense, simply to be a sentient, self-regulating organism is to be subject to an ongoing imperative to adapt one's body to accord with the demands of one's world. From a contemporary perspective, if pain is indeed an allostatic, or even a more narrowly homeostatic command, this should be unsurprising. The majority of self-regulatory biological processes happen under the radar. It should be no more surprising to say that we are always subject to pain than to say that we are always subject to the imperative to breathe. This is not to say that we always notice the pain, or even less to say that we always have a necessary affective response to the pain. Like other allostatic sensations, a pain sensation becomes salient only when background self-regulatory processes are not sufficient to maintain the organism's stability through changing conditions. In short, we become consciously subject to the body's command to adapt a specific body part only when that part is felt to be under threat. So long as an organism is able to create an appropriate instantiation, this command may be satisfied not just by returning to what one was, but also by changing into something new, with the different conditions for satisfying a particular pain being constrained by the particular internal and external conditions of the organism and its environment. This is how the allostatic imperativism that I propose here understands the import of the Pratibhijna focus on pain as the unstable movement at the edge of one's bodily agency that gives rise to the desire to find rest by creatively authoring the forms of one's embodiment in the world. So if my analyses thus far are convincing, then it is possible to satisfy pain by transforming rather than by protecting the boundaries of one's embodied agency. Pain is not just about homeostatic error correction. It includes heterostatic anticipatory responses. I highlight two reasons why this matters. Seeing pain as allostatically adaptive first sheds new light on why people might seek out pain, and second, allows for a reconceptualization of the distinction between pain sensation and pain affect that does not rely on postulating a higher order agent. So Klein makes remarks that are relevant to the first of these points in his discussion of masochistic pleasure, where his focus is on providing a philosophically sensitive description of what is pleasant in masochistic pleasures. Klein recognizes a range of such pleasures, from the pleasure of wiggling a loose tooth, to sexual masochism, to aesthetic ambivalence, his term for the enjoyment of negative aspects of a work of art. He takes them to be essentially penumbral, pleasant because we push ourselves just to the edge of what we can take, but not over. While Klein's typology is sensitive to many aspects of masochistic pleasures, his commitment to the body's command being protective obscures what may be the most distinctive aspect of masochistic pleasure. Pleasure and pain that goes past one's edge, that fundamentally breaks down one's bodily boundaries so that one may form oneself anew. In this case, masochistic pleasure wouldn't be the pleasure of satisfying the body's command. One satisfies the command when one is able to rest in a newly adaptive form. Once the bodily boundary is appropriately created, the pain is gone. If masochistic pleasure truly coincides with pain, it should only be able to arise within the process of adaptation, not as a result of the pain stopping. So if masochistic pleasure isn't simply compensatory, then we need something other than the pleasure that arises from when the pain stops. Taking a note from Abhinavagupta, perhaps the distinctive thing at the heart of masochistic pleasure is simply the joy of open creativity, the freedom experienced when the intensity of the body's command spurs one to recognize oneself as actively authoring one's own boundaries. This freedom would be radically curtailed if all pain could command were to protect. But if the command is to allostatically adapt, possibilities abound, and it becomes clearer why pain can sometimes be felt as joy. This understanding of masochistic pleasure builds on Klein's understanding of suffering, but recasts it in line with Abhinava's take on the possible co-presence of pain and joy. One of the advantages of imperativism in general is that it opens a conceptual space for understanding the distinction between pain and suffering/hurt/painfulness. Klein's understanding of this distinction is as follows. Pain is a command issued by our bodies that serves to protect our integrity as physical things. Painfulness is a command issued with respect to pain and many other states that serves to protect our integrity as agents. His distinction between pain and painfulness then maps two different domains, ruled over by the body and by the agent respectively, as well as two different kinds of commands, a first-order one whose content directly concerns the body, and a second-order one whose content is hybrid. Pain, while imbued with the urgency that corresponds to the degree to which one accepts the practical authority of the body, need not be inherently connected to any particular affect. Affect is the domain of the agent. So this could work in some ways, and accepting pain as an allostatic command doesn't provide any particular problems, but it remains unclear within Klein's rough framework of contemporary materialist naturalism what a non-bodily agent that is distinct from a bodily agent might be. Now, I certainly don't expect that any theorist who wants to talk about bodily agency should have an independent solution to the heart problem. But if there's an account of the relationship between pain and suffering that isn't subject to the additional complications of positing and connecting multiple agents in relation to one individual, it seems that this account would be preferable, at least insofar as it is more parsimonious. The allostatic imperativist understanding of masochistic pleasures that I've sketched indicates that it is possible to understand the distinction between pain and affect accompanying pain within an imperativist framework without introducing a non-bodily agent. Masochistic pleasures need not be in spite of the pain. Rather, the divide between pain and affect need not be a divide between body and agent, but a question of how one's response to the command to adapt a part of one's body sits within the internal and external bounds of one's embodied world. Gonna skip a tiny bit there. Okay, so what all this is getting at is that the feeling of being responsible for one's continued survival can directly induce the full range of affects that I suggest properly accompanies pain, spanning from excitement and joy to anxiety and suffering. Perhaps suffering and other negative affects linked to pain are responses that occur when one is commanding oneself to adapt a part of one's body, but is not positioned in the world in such a way that the form of the part that one strives toward is tenable. The extent to which pain is accompanied by negative or positive affect would track the extent to which one is frustrated or supported in adapting the body part in response to a threat, with this tracking happening along a spectrum that is sensitive to mixed or changing conditions. All right, so getting back to the communal stuff. So the simple form of my proposal is that all of these dynamics that belong to individual pain apply to communal pain too. From the contemporary analytic side, we can recognize that our sense of bodily integrity is not reducible to the sum of each of the parts that our body feels, that our body may feel are stable or not stable. The instability that spurs adaptation concerns the organism as a whole. Pratyabhijna accounts of agential fluidity as allowing rest at different levels of reality provide both a metaphysics and a mechanism to explain how we get this sense of the organism as a whole, which grounds the sense of each part as a proper aspect but is not reducible to their sum. Pratyabhijna accounts of agential fluidity indicate that the bodies subject to pain need not be individual human bodies. The instability that drives agential integration through the exclusion of what is other occurs at all levels of reality. One articulation of the Pratyabhijna ontology alters and appropriates the classical Sankhyan picture of the universe as a real transformation, a parinama, of two ontologically distinct realities, in sentient material nature, prakriti, and a certain type of pure consciousness, purusha. In classical Sankhya, prakriti encompasses the entirety of the conventional world of change, including the structures of thought and sensation. It has two primary modalities, manifest and unmanifest. In its unmanifest state, prakriti contains the seeds of all the structures of manifest reality within itself in latent form. Purusha is pure contentless consciousness. It is eternal, unchanging, immaterial, and does not act. However, it is the witness of the fluctuations of the intellect and provides the illumination necessary to create experience. Although Purusha is unchanging and therefore never acts, Prakriti is somehow influenced by Purusha and due to this influence manifests the structures of reality in increasingly gross forms. These structures, plus Prakriti and Purusha themselves, are enumerated as the 25 tattvas, which go from the mental capacities down to the 5 gross elements. So the Pratyabhijna Shaiva's significant reworking of the Sankhyan tattvas, like all Shaivas did around this time, provides a paradigm for expressing the idea that the manifest diversity of the universe is the result of a progressive unfolding of an ultimate reality that is itself beyond the categories of one and many. Pratyabhijna thinkers alter the Sankhyan understanding of the tattvas in 2 significant ways. First, they add 11, sometimes 12, additional tattvas to the 25 Sankhyan ones, resulting in 36, sometimes 37. The additional tattvas are larger orders of reality that encompass, exceed, and ground the sunken ones. All of these tattvas occur within the body of Parameshvara, who represents consciousness in its absolute, non-dual form that grounds and exceeds any possible limitation. And second, in their articulation of the relationship between the tattvas, the Shaivas resolutely reject the idea that Prakriti and Purusha are ontologically distinct realities, or indeed that there is any true ontological distinction between levels of reality. Any world is a particular delimitation of the creative agency of consciousness itself. As consciousness moves down the hierarchy of tattvas, its own nature as non-dual self-awareness becomes progressively obscured as more and more of its capacity for self-determination is excluded. The key point for our purposes is that larger levels of reality, which are constituted by attending to more of what is habitually ignored as one navigates an embodied world, non-reductively ground smaller levels. The tattvas provide an ontological heuristic that allowed Pratibhijna thinkers to articulate the grounds for why, although the entirety of the universe is always Shiva, certain beings will perceive more or less limited segments of its reality. The divisions between these levels of reality are fluid, since both the levels themselves and particular embodied positions within these levels are formed through attention and habit-driven exclusion. What we ignore, both individually and collectively, literally creates our realities. Pain, as the instability with regard to bodily boundaries, is the command the embodied living being issues to itself to find a level that affords rest. Rest may be found, and pain may issue its command with regard to larger or smaller levels of reality. Communal suffering or communal joy, like individual suffering and joy, map the spread of affects that properly accompany pain as an allostatic imperative. So, I hope that the allostatic imperativism about pain that I proposed builds on the success of current pain imperativism while opening doors to further understanding the link between pain and the conversion of forms of embodiment in the world. Pain is the body's command to adapt a part of itself, a command that can be satisfied either through protection or through transformation. Imperativist theories of pain point directly at the contingency and frailty of bodies in the world, but the response to things falling apart need not always be to hold them together. Instead, it could be to build something new, and this new creation can be valuable precisely because it breaks through one's homeostatic patterns. The affect that accompanies this command will span the entire range of affects that properly belong to the recognition of one's responsibility to continuously author one's own bodily instantiation in the world, where one here may be a community as much as an individual. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a long ways from snowy Vermont, but I'm very delighted, and thank you very much, Sean, for organizing this panel. This is, as he suggested, on the afflictions of identity. It's a lot of what are the reasons, what are the causes, what are the conditions, as the Buddhists would say, about why there's so much problem in the world, why we create so much conflict and trauma for ourselves. It's traumatic enough to be living in these contingent bodies that get old and decrepit and decay right out from under us, isn't it? Now, some of you know, and some of you will find out. So this is the basic, no, that did not go, okay. Okay, clicker. Okay. So I have, some of these slides have a lot of words and some not so many. This is the basic outline here. Early Buddhism presents a world in which everything is in flux, and out of this interactions we create habits and then biases and find different ways to fix identities particularly in terms of subject, self, and other, just like what Kat was talking about, that bind and blind us. And this is the problem. This creates a lot of suffering and dukkha for ourselves and others. Seeing through this and letting go of these constructions is liberating. That's the basic model. This is then reformulated, reframed, you could say, in the Yogacara tradition, 3rd to 5th century of the Common Era in India, in terms of the three natures, which is, I'm using it as a very general rubric for reframing what the problem is. We falsely imagine the world's populated with fixed identities and essences, but when we analyze what appears as given, we find out it is just constructed. These falsely imagined essences occur dependent on our cognitive processes, and most of which, and this is the Yogacara innovation, most of which occur unconsciously and collectively. Makes them a lot harder to see and deal with. Our conscious perceptions are then informed by our non-conscious and cultural categories that give rise to our collective worlds, our lived worlds, in the sort of German phenomenology, Bhajana Loka. Realizing this empowers us to reconstruct our collective world. That is, to choose how to respond to trauma, as Kat was just saying. It gives us the freedom and responsibility to do so. So this is a lovely overlap with our presentations here. So I'm going to just talk briefly about sort of the early Buddhist orientation to the world that we live in, the three characteristics of existence, the Trilakshana. Everything, all phenomena are impermanent. They lack an essential or unchanging self, and that gives rise to suffering, anxiety, dis-ease, right? Things are going to constantly change. Our bodies are changing out from under us. We can also think of this as life is a process of dependent relations that we experience as anxiety or dissatisfactoriness, right? Things are constantly in flux and interacting, and there's nothing that we can ultimately hold on to, they would say, as an unchanging essence of who we are. Obviously, lots of different traditions disagree with that. So from this point of view, what we are is a stream of being, or a stream of mind, of awareness, chitta santana, that are patterns that persist. Not entities that exist, but patterns that persist. This is a really crucial kind of orientation. So we're just a recurrent pattern in a web of ongoing causal relations, and that is what is meant by dependent arising. And this is depicted in the wheel of dependent arising, the wheel of life, Pratitya Samutpada, which we can see on the murals of many Buddhist temples and monasteries across Asia and other places. I think of this very much in terms of patterns of impersonal causal relations. When X is, Y arises. So this is a syntax. This is a way of thinking about causal relations that does not require an intentional agent to act upon something which appears to be a separate object. It's the interaction of things that allow them to occur. And this is very much the kind of language that we see in most of the natural and social sciences. Things come about through processes of interaction. And we do not need to impute agents, intentional agents, behind all of it. So I'm just going to explain all of how this works in this simple little chart here. That is very, very accurate for those of you who are into early Buddhism. And it's really wonderful, but we're going to only go on the highlights. So the highlight here is, of course, bad habits. Anybody here have some bad habits? A couple of us, yes? So, where do habits come from? Like I used to not drink coffee. I'm in the process of quitting. Then I got a habit of drinking coffee. And what happened? And then one day I decided to quit. What do you think happened? I got a really bad headache, right? There's a physiological effect of getting dependent upon external sources of caffeine, right? And that question to ask is, where was that habit before I started drinking coffee? If talking about existence of things really mattered, then you'd have to say that coffee pre-existed my drinking it. But no physiologist would think that, right? The coffee came about through repeated actions, right? So where does the coffee habit go when I quit it? Coffee heaven? It just stops. And this is the syntax of dependent arising, of things arising through repeated actions. And so the 12 links of dependent arising are very, very early on organized into 3 categories. And that is, there are certain actions, such as karmic actions, such as grasping, repelling. It gives rise to certain results, a pleasant or painful feeling, a neutral feeling, which we typically respond to in an afflictive fashion. That is, something which causes us to do more actions. That is, craving, aversion, ignorance. I crave when the caffeine gets metabolized. What do? We take another sip, right? And so we grasp at that because we want the pleasant feeling. When we stop drinking it, we want to avoid the pain from that. And so we have aversion, and then we take some more. And these are built up. These are habit patterns that are built up through time. And from this point of view, in a sense, we can understand how our beings come about, how species come about, how things in the world come about through patterns of interaction. And this, of course, includes ourselves, and this is really important, that our sense of identity here, from this perspective, is something which is constructed. It comes about, and developmental psychologists would certainly agree with this. We come to identify with our feelings and our thoughts and our sensations and our intentions, etc. The five aggregates, if you're familiar with the Buddhist analyses here. And we imagine that this is I, this is who I am, this is mine, and this is not mine. So we grasp on to whatever is mine and try to repel and push away things that we don't like. Just like what Kat was talking about, this creation of self and other, as it were. And this is also the way that perceptual processes are analyzed. And so perceptual processes is a typical formula of dependent arising. Dependent upon I and visible forms, visual cognitive awareness arises. And this term, this clicker is not very large. A visible form impinges upon a particular kind of visual faculty, and cognitive awareness arises. This is a pattern of interaction. And this is very similar to what we see with the phenomenon of color. And color has been widely studied in cognitive science. And so people are colorblind. Different kinds of beings have different kinds of retinas, different sorts of visual cortex, etc., flies and bats and all kinds of things. Colors are interactional because they arise from the interactions of our brain's reflective properties of objects and electromagnetic radiation. They are not objective. Yeah, there is in the grass or sky no greenness or blueness, independent of the retina's, color cones, neural circuitry, and brains of sentient beings. Nor are colors purely subjective. They're neither a figment of our imagination nor spontaneous creations of our brains. Color is a function of the world and our biology interacting. This is George Lakoff and Michael Johnson from Philosophy of the Flesh, which some of you are probably familiar with. This is really, really close to what the Buddhists are saying. All right? That our experience of the world is a function of our embodiment, being in the world and interacting in an environment. And I think I like this, making sort of visual images. I sort of tend to think visually in many ways. Cognition is an interactive process. Also depends on habituation. And what that means is that we, just like our coffee habits come about through repeated interaction, our ability to observe, to experience discrete objects in the world comes about through repeated interaction. Neonates, newborn babies, do not have their visual cortex wired up. Their retinas don't distinguish things very well. In a sense, they don't really see objects. That is through repeated interaction. The same is true for understanding the relationship between grabbing onto something, our muscle memory coordinated with our visual cortex, etc. These are all complex behaviors that come about through repeated interaction, right? Which we then take for granted because they become habituated. We don't notice what we're doing, how we're experiencing that, and all the processes underlying that, because they have now become embodied and habituated. And so, in a sense, then, we don't really know what the world is outside of our faculties. And so here, what they're saying is that interactive processes occur not just at the individual level, but at the species-specific levels. That is, the kind of world, the kind of lived world that we live in, they were called loka in Sanskrit and Pali, the kind of lived world that we live in is dependent upon the structure of our faculties, our sensory and mental faculties. So in this sense, different species live in different kinds of worlds. This is a very important point for trying to understand a lot of Indian Buddhism, that the world that we experience is a function of, as they would say, our bodies and our biologies and objects interacting. It's not something which is simply out there, or that what our knowledge and experience of it is embodied by our habits, by the habits that have been constructed over time. So that raises some really interesting question about what we might call the ontology of the world. And that is, in this fathom-long body, with its perceptions and thoughts, this is an early passage from early Buddhist teachings, there's the world, the arising of the world, the cessation of the world, the path leading to the cessation of the world. Obviously, the world here means the lived world that we are embodied and interacting in. When the Buddha realized nirvana and had the cessation for the world, it didn't disappear when he became liberated. So what does that tell us about what is beyond the boundary of our perceptions and conceptions? How do we know? How could we know? This is a really, important kind of question. We can have experience of things just simply disappearing, right? These sort of non-conceptual kinds of experiences. But then, in a sense, the world comes back out of that, and then we bring back with it, out of these non-conceptual kinds of experiences, all of our underlying predispositions and biases, etc. This is a problem that is addressed in all kinds of contemplative literature. So, to summarize, the first half here, we imagine that there are independent objects, entities, and identities. We don't see the interdependent processes in terms of causes and conditions. Often, that doesn't mean always. Actions turn into habits which create structures. By the repetition of action results in reaction. We identify with them and we become bound by these habits because we don't even recognize that they are constructed habits. So we're limited by our constructed world relative to our human faculties. And seeing the constructed nature of these structures is liberating and empowering. That is the early Buddhist view. So now we're going to jump to the Yogacarans, a few 600, 700, 800 years after the time of the Buddha. And it's the second major school of Mahayana after the Nagarjuna and what would later be called the Madhyamaka school. And its two main writers, especially philosophers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. Their main points here are the three cognitive modes, the three natures, which I introduced us to, the unconscious constructive processes, which I'm going to spend more time on, and this notion that our way we experience the world is a cognition or a perception which is bound up in these patterns of interaction. And so in a sense then, what is being added here in terms of the three natures is very parallel to what we saw in the early Buddhist analyses. That is, we falsely identify fixed entities and identities. We can see how this occurs through interdependent cognitive processes. We are bound by these, by acculturation and socialization, and we unconsciously identify with these worlds, and these construct collective implicit worlds that are relative to our cultural categories. We're going to spend more time on what this means here. And then, of course, it is liberating to be able to see our cultural constructed categories as constructed, as collective, and as categories. So the three natures here is, oops, pushing the wrong buttons. That really pushes my button. The three natures, I won't talk about this much more because I already said it. Falsely imagining essences is the core existential or epistemological fault. This is the parikalpita svabhava. These appearances arise dependent upon our cognitive processes, the paratantra svabhava, and we're freed by realizing things as they truly are, their interdependence, their thusness in Mahayana speech, parinishpana svabhava. So how does this happen? What is this collective and non-conscious level of construction of our collective worlds? This is what I want to spend some time on here. And this is the notion of the storehouse consciousness, the alaya vijnana, if you're familiar with that. Subliminal awareness arises influenced by the body, by cognitive schemas and language. This is a text. This is a passage right out of the Samdhina Mochana Sutra, which is dated to the 3rd to 5th century or so by historians. From traditional Mahayana point of view, it was taught by the Buddha, of course. And there's a really interesting passage, I think, that needs to be unpacked. The subliminal mind, this is alaya vijnana, a level of unconscious cognitive processes. With all of its potentialities, congeals, grows, develops, increases, dependent upon two conditions. This is the syntax-dependent arising. The material sense faculties and our tendencies towards runaway associations based on characteristics, names, and preconceptions in everyday use. That's a long set of terms. Nimitta nama vikalpa vyavahara papancha vasana upadana. What are all these terms mean? This is very interesting. Non-conscious processes arise, conditioned not just by the body, but all the tendencies, the runaway associations based on characteristics, names, and preconceptions in everyday use. Signs, or the names, are the basic marks or characteristics by one thing is distinguished from another. The categories that we operate in that have become so habituated we don't recognize we're operating in them. The names in everyday use. The ones that sort of strike certain kinds of associations, that the concepts whose proto-categorizations pre-configure and construct our conscious perceptions without us being aware of it. All of these various kinds of categories, in a sense, they get wired up. That's what it means to be able to recognize something. The process that is really obvious in the first few years of our lives, but constantly, ongoingly, right? And these underlie and inform and help structure the way that we consciously experience the world. The proliferating tendencies, the prapancha, who's run about woulda, shoulda, coulda, very much self-oriented, that sort of cause panic attacks, that just give us endless pleasure or pain, which one depends on how we respond to it, right? The runaway ruminations reflect the endless rabbit hole of reflective self-consciousness. The predispositions to all of these, the substratum or fuel, sustaining our deepest cognitive processes. That's what's going on at the non-conscious level. The inner conditions is what it's called here. Oops, that's the wrong one again. So there's also contingent or correlative with these inner conditions or these outer objects, as they are called. And what are the objects? How do we subliminally interact in the world here, is what it's saying. The outward perception of the shared world are the objects that are aspects whose aspects are undiscerned. We have a subliminal level of understanding how we are in the world. We have proprioception, if you're familiar with that in cognitive science. Ongoingly, we understand ourselves in relation to the world without really thinking about it. And the continuous interrupted perception of the shared world based upon that very alaya vijnana, which has inner appropriation as support. This is a commentary on this phrase. The outward perception of the shared world whose aspects are undiscerned means the uninterrupted perception is based upon alaya vijnana, who has inner appropriation. That is, all of the terms, the names, concepts, preconceptions used in everyday use, is correlative with a world that we sort of not quite consciously understand and perceive, because it's subtle and difficult to discern by worldly sages. So in a sense, Our species-specific cognitive processes, the world that we experience is correlative with the structure of our faculties, and it gives rise to conscious perception. But at the same time, we have all these non-conscious processes going on that are equally correlative. And how did that happen? What's that? I can see that. It's not going. I don't know what it did. Okay. So the basic point is that the correlation between faculties, our embodied faculties, and the way the objects that we experience in the world, the way we experience the world, are correlative with each other. We can think about this very much in terms of visual awareness, and again, different kinds of animals.
Just quickly, just to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, go back on.
Now that gave that away. Our cognitive schemas, linguistic predispositions, abhilapa, vasana, if you're familiar with Sanskrit. These are correlative with the way that we subliminally interact in the world without having to be totally aware of this. And both of these are become conscious, as it were, or they inform the way that we consciously experience the world. Our conscious perceptions are deeply constructed, they're saying. And we understand this very simply in two links. If you're familiar with this little bit old book by Malcolm Caldwell, what is it? The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. Now, he's not a Zen Buddhist. But what he's talking about is this, the way we experience the world, we sort of automatically kind of characterize things and categorize things without thinking about it. It just occurs like that, because these categories and classifications are deeply neurologically embedded, right, and habituated through time. They're not given, it's not a true picture of reality, our perceptions are constantly being constructed at both conscious and unconscious levels. Street smarts is a really good example, I think, of this. With street smarts, in rural Vermont, you don't need a lot of street smarts, I can tell you that. But I got a lot, my street smarts, basic, I didn't grow up in Vermont, but most of my street smarts are from India. And it's a different set, but they kind of, work a lot. Street smarts, that's where everything's going on, unconsciously, all these categorizations, all these associations, etc. And this is what we identify with all of these deep-seated dispositions and categories. So the next innovative concept, really, that the Yogacaras are introducing is that the sense of self is also not conscious. It also operates at a subliminal level, very deeply. If you're familiar with the work of Antonio Damasio in neuroscience, the self comes to mind. Is very, very similar to what we see in Yogacara. Another passage here from the Yogacara Bhumi, our afflicted ego, that's misspelled, is always associated with the four afflictions which arise innately and concurrently. A view of self-existence, an identification with our bodies and feelings, etc., such drishti, the conceit, I am, self-love, and ignorance. Right? These are constantly going on. We're always experiencing ourselves as I in relation to outside and to other. And the afflicted mind, this is associated with these four afflictions, which conceives I-making, ahamkara, and the conceit I am, always arises and functions simultaneously with alaya awareness, taking it as its object and conceiving it as I am this and this is I. These are operating at subliminal levels. So we're constantly identifying with this whole range of various kinds of influences and categorizations that inform our unconscious cognitive processes and the way that what we consciously experience is already radically structured. And that is to say, and this is just sort of unpacking commenting really on these previous passages, we consciously identify and are attached to the continuity of our bodily experience. The alaya vijnana is said to pervade the entire body. Alaya vijnana is actually just a set of unconscious processes. We can think of this as part of our nervous system, etc. The entrenched social and cultural categories of conventional names and images, right? That was what the inner conditions were. These are names and categories, things that are linguistic and everyday use, are social and cultural, right? Our unconscious processes are socially and culturally constructed and formulated in the processes of acculturation and socialization. The persistence of our cognitive habits, which we tend to perceive, conceive, and react, is based upon our complexes that are constructed through past actions, samskaras. They come about. Our habits are samskaras. Samskaras are largely habits or structures that are created through habituation. So we have certain ways that we respond to things. And then the ongoing karmic potentialities from our past behavioral patterns, our potentialities for results to occur from our past behavior, right? We identify with these things. This is me and this is I, right? This is my body, right? This is the culture I belong to. When those people do things differently, there's something wrong with them. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that kind of crap. Excuse me. We identify with these, right? And I'm going to skip this one. So they also say, and we're doing, what? Okay. So this is the distinction between the individual sort of set of habits and the way that we unconsciously construct, in a sense, the lived world, and that which is collective and social is very, very clearly articulated in the Yogacara teachings. From the Mahayana Samgraha, a compendium of Mahayana written by Asanga, it says the uncommon aspect of this non-conscious set of processes is the seed of the individual sense spheres, and the common aspect of alaya vijnana is the seed of the shared world, the bhajana loka. What does this mean? The common aspect is the seed of the shared world, means it is the cause of perceptions which appear as the shared world, and it's common because these perceptions appear similarly to all who experience them in accordance with their similar karma. Now this is a very close translation, and we can look at this very carefully. We experience things similarly because we have similar bodies with similar faculties. Everybody here is understanding my English, I hope. And so we have learned in English words, English syntax, etc. things. And so we have a similar kind of karmic background to learn these kinds of things. And so why do we have similar faculties? Why have we come, in a sense, to understand this particular kind of language? Because this is in accordance with our own similar karma. According to karmic theory in South Asian tradition, we have the kinds of bodies that we have because of our past karma. And so in that sense, it's species specific, but it also depends upon the particular kinds of karma we have to be in one place or another. This, I think, is a really important part of this. Is that we have the kinds of bodies we have, and we have a similar world on account of that. So our perceptions appear similarly in accordance with a similar karma. This is not just individual, but also social and cultural. And so this introduces the shared world of intersubjectivity, right? And what do we do with this shared world of intersubjectivity? Doing well. Jessica Zhu is going to be talking about this in a couple of days, a little bit more. So what we do is we sacralize this. We sacralize our worlds. And now I'm drawing upon really more social science than yogacaras here. But I think we need to, in terms of trauma and healing, we need to really think in these terms to a large degree. Individualism is not a fact of nature. It may not surprise everybody here, but it surprises people in other parts of this country. It's a social agreement with a history. It's come about with causes and conditions, right? Cultural attitudes have causes and conditions. They have a history, a genealogy. It is agreed upon by many people, so it's collective, It's justified by ideals and concepts, so it becomes ideational. These narratives are taken as given, how things simply are, rather than as constructed. Then they become ideological, right? And when these narratives are invested with and protected by emotional and moral meaning, we sacralize them. And insofar as sacred narratives underlie our tacit understandings of reality, they operate at non-conscious levels, right? About what ultimately should be, because God said this, or God said that, or our tradition says this, our tradition says that, and we are often not even aware of these implicit assumptions unless or until we come up upon difference with really deep-seated different tacit assumptions, and that makes our own assumptions more clear, and we become self-conscious about it and have an opportunity for seeing them as collective agreements. So in a sense then, these are our unconscious collective realities, our shared world. We can wake up from this, the texts say, and I won't read this whole thing, but this is the last part of the 20 verses by Vasubandhu, that the world is asleep from tendencies to false conceptualization. We're seen as if in a dream, an imagined object. Not having been awakened, it does not understand its constructed nature of that object. But when one's awakened to the transcendental non-conceptual wisdom that is the antidote to that sleep, then one understands it as it is the constructed nature of this object. This is liberating. And I want to talk about one of the processes here that Thich Nhat Hanh suggests. Are we just starting to get, 5 minutes, right?
You achieve cessation.
Okay, so please do fix it. So this is the non-conceptual wisdom is an experience in deep meditative state in which all categories and all sense of self disappear and stop momentarily, or maybe for some period of time, during which people see reality as it is unmediated by these kinds of categories. And of course, this is a deeply liberating insight, and is not achieved easily. It's not working at all. What happened? It's going to lead to more proliferation anyways. Thank you, Sean. So where were we going with this? Okay, I'll just talk through this. Okay. This passage from Thich Nhat Hanh, a great Vietnamese teacher who's actually very literate in the Yogacara tradition, passed away a couple of years ago. Our fears are always lying in the depths of our consciousness. And with mindfulness, whenever those seeds sprout, we can recognize them. Oh, it's you, I know you. This recognition will cause them to lose some of their power over us. We know they're lying there in the basement of our stored consciousness, and we invite them up into our mind consciousness when it is not occupied with other things, and we shine the light of mindfulness onto it. There we go. Oops. It's stored in the storehouse. Lavanga is a little bit different. We invite the sadness, despair, regrets, and longing in the past that have been difficult for us to touch, and we sit down and talk to them like old friends. This is such a generous sense of who we are and what all of our baggage, as it were, and all of the baggage that can become the compost to grow the seeds of wisdom and compassion in the Mahayana view. This is not easy. Healing the brokenness and facing our inner demons. This is a beautiful passage from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams in a book on Radical Dharma by Black American Buddhist, mostly American Buddhist teachers. We have to integrate our wounds into the understanding of who we are and what we are really capable of so that we can become whole human beings. Only from there can we begin the process of healing the brokenness, the brokenheartedness within ourselves that is then the foundation for beginning to heal that in our larger society. I think this is really a call, in a sense, of engaged Buddhism, that the process of healing our inner brokenness, our trauma, as it were, through constructing our various kinds of worlds with all of their methods of creating trauma. As an inner practice, this becomes then the basis of external social activism, Buddhist engagement, really, from a Yogacara point of view. I think this is a really, you guys have something like that all going on in your unconscious? Lots of people do, but they don't know it, and so they project it out onto somebody else, and then use that as an excuse to beat them up, right? Unfortunately, all too common. It's called scapegoating, which is an old practice that we see in the Bible as well, and it's universal almost around the world. But there's a way out, and just very, very briefly, yes, very briefly, good. What the Yogacaryas are going to say is that there's a liberation through a fundamental transformation. We go down to the bottom of the well, as Stephen Holden said this morning. We go down to the bottom of the well, and below the personal dimension, below this symbolic and cultural dimension that he mentioned from the Freudian and Jungian psychology, we find this much more fundamental sense, especially articulated in the Mahayana tradition, that the pure Dharma realm, which is not different than our own fundamental being, the source of all doctrines, qualities, essences of the Buddhas, essentially pure, etc., free from all conceptualizations. Through this process of purification, etc., all these different dimensions of who we are, the storehouse consciousness, the afflicted mentation, which I mentioned before, both of which are non-conscious, the mental consciousness, and the five sense consciousness gets transformed when we lose our deep-seated sense of self and other, when we recognize our collective projections, as it were, are that. They're collective projections. They're constructed, and we can see through them and free ourselves from them. And then our capacities all have the ability to work wisely and compassionately in the world for the liberation of all beings, or the cessation of suffering. And this is portrayed iconographically in, first we see the five Buddhas, the five Buddha families. This is early Tantra from the Guhya Samaja, which is dated around the same time as the Yogacaras. And these are correlated very clearly with different processes, different afflictions and different wisdoms and different skandhas and different parts of the aggregates of who we are, as the possibility of this purification and ability to then act in the world free of all of these obscurations that bind and blind us. And we see this in chaityas, or little stupas, all around Kathmandu, in fact, the older parts of Kathmandu, the five Buddha families, as well, and even which are continued to be places where people do certain types of puja or worship. And then we see this with the five wisdoms and the mandala of the five Buddha families. So altogether, they've talked about a problem, the arising of habits, of self-centeredness, etc., which is a correlative with the world we experience, is correlative with our inner drives, our inner categories, etc. This operates collectively, it operates non-consciously. Through processes of meditation, mindfulness, analysis, etc., we can learn to see through these and liberate these energies for action in the world. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm not going to introduce myself as I did my colleagues, but I'm from around here, and I'm in the department here. And I'm going to sort of keep on with our happy theme this afternoon. I want to talk about pain, physical pain, suffering, and the time of life, namely the ways in which our experiences of pain and suffering structure our life. Structure our time consciousness, structure diachronically the way we inhabit the world. And I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. In particular, I'm interested to interrogate ways in which both Buddhist philosophers and contemporary philosophers of pain have tried to dissociate these two things, right? So in the sort of Buddhist picture, sometimes modern mindfulness teachers will say things like, pain is necessary, suffering is optional. Contemporary analytic philosophy of pain is really interested in trying to use conceptual analysis to distinguish between physical pain and psychological suffering. The purpose of this talk is to try and complicate this relationship a little bit. And I'm going to do so by making the following argument. I'm going to argue in a vein very similar to some things that Kat was saying in her talk, that pains are homeodynamic affects. I use the term homeodynamic rather than homeostatic because I don't think that stasis really adequately describes anything that's going on in a living system. Stasis is what happens when living systems die. Living systems are dynamic by remaining viable and alive to perturbations. Okay, so when I talk about homeodynamic affects, I'm talking about homeostatic affects, but I use the term homeodynamic because I think it's more descriptively adequate to the phenomenon. So pains are homeodynamic affects. Homeodynamic affects have what I'm going to call, following the phenomenological philosophical tradition, horizontal and not just object intentionality. I'm also going to argue that homeodynamic affects are partially constitutive of what I'll call existential suffering. And I'm going to rely on the Buddhist philosophers to unpack what I mean by existential suffering. But in short, the idea is something like the following. We are porous with respect to a world and remain fundamentally and consistently agitated as a result of this, in ways that we tend to avoid and ignore, hence us being very ignorant and dysregulated, chaotic beings. I mean, I'm sure this applies to none of you, of course, but I'm just saying in general. All right, now the conclusion then, of course, follows that pains then have horizontal intentionality and are partially constitutive of existential suffering. Okay, so first question, who cares, so what? Here's why this matters. I think there's sort of two explanatory burdens that I'm going to try and discharge in the course of my discussion today. First, I just want to use the nomenclature of contemporary philosophical analyses of pain to explicate some interesting notions about the nature of dukkha in Buddhist philosophy. Buddhists, for different reasons and in different periods of their history, are fond of reminding us of how much suffering there is in the world. And the most fundamental form of suffering is constant. You're basically always agitated on some level. And one objection that people raise here quite naturally is that, why should I pay attention to this? Like, I'm fine up here at the ordinary coarse grain level. I'm a happy person. Why would I want to get underneath that to get in touch with this fundamental constant agitation you allege is somewhere in my subconscious? I'm going to try and address that. I think you should all be aware of how miserable you are. So, yeah, it's going to be a good afternoon. The second explanatory burden I hope to discharge here is that by using the philosophical resources of Buddhist philosophy, I want to demonstrate for the contemporary analytic philosophers of pain that they're actually much more stitched into an existential predicament than their particular patterns of conceptual analysis would admit. That when you start to take seriously the biology of pain, you have to take seriously the fact that you are a finite agent who is tacitly aware of your own death. And that there's part of what it is to feel. So, yeah, you're all going to die, and between now and then, you're going to listen to me talk about how this is all going to work out for you. It's not going to work out for you. It's the end of the story. Sorry. I'm a little morose. It's coming from a good place. Here's the outline. I'm going to die, you're going to die. No. So part one, I'm going to give you an argument for the first premise of the argument. Then we're going to do a little excursion into the Buddhist thought world around suffering and just sort of unpack that notion, which is going to equip me to then make further arguments, in particular the argument for the second premise, and then finally in part 4, with the help of Aryadeva and Chandrakirti, an argument for the third premise, which will then get us the conclusion of the argument. Okay, so part 1. I'm going to divide this. I'm going to give you some conceptual analysis, and then I'm going to give you some phenomenological description to try and motivate the first premise of my argument, okay? So, some conceptual analysis. What are homeodynamic affects? These are the kinds of affects that let you know something is out of balance in the body. Okay, so when homeodynamic balance is disturbed by perturbations from the environment, then more particular episodic and local homeodynamic affects arise. So if there's a rise in the concentration of salt in your bloodstream, for example, you're going to feel thirsty. That's your body telling you that you're deficient with respect to potable liquids. If it's been too long since your last feeding and you feel hungry, that's your body telling you that there's a deficiency with respect to necessary nutrients. When you feel the need to go to the washroom and relieve yourself, that's your body telling you there's an excess of waste in the body that needs to be expunged. We are constantly reacting to these kinds of communications from the body all the time. Okay? And the conceptual idea here, and this is something that I'll borrow similar to Kat's talk from Colin Klein, who's written a brilliant book on the nature of pain that everyone should read, that this applies to pains. That pains are like this. Pains are not just value representations of noxious stimuli. They actually have a sort of self-referring architecture that gives us knowledge of the ways in which the body's equilibrium has been disturbed in different ways. So he says here that pain's primary role, the one that can't be replaced, is to keep us from aggravating existing injuries. So the conceptual point here, I allege, is that pain is a kind of imperative. Now, I'm not going to make too many arguments about the nature of the imperative content versus descriptive content. We can talk about that in the question period if people have issues here. But the idea is that, among other things, pains tell you to do stuff. Right? Protect the ankle that you just rolled. Don't walk on it. All right? These imperatives tell you to protect some part of the body in order to allow it to heal so that homeodynamic equilibrium can be reestablished. What it is for something to be a pain, and this is the definition, is for a feeling to tell you that things are out of balance and to take some kind of protective or corrective measure. Now, I'm actually happy to be a complex pluralistic theorist about pain's content. There might be other non-imperative contents to pain. Pain is very complex. So I'm not going to be an exclusive imperativist here. But it's just, I wanted to say this is an irreducible part of what it means to experience a pain. Okay? Yeah, I don't think anything too controversial here, but anyways. Second, let's do a little phenomenology. Okay, so pains, among other things, they motivate us, right? They have a motivational push to tell the organism to correct the felt excess or deficiency. And part of what gives the feeling, other homeodynamic feelings, like pains, thirst, hunger, etc., that motivating quality is it lets the organism know that things are out of balance, and that lack of balance is felt by the organism when a local sensation arises. But I submit to you that that means then that the organism must have some sense of what balance means, okay? Such that departure from it is felt as significant, as meaningful, as important. And that holistic sense of balance in the body becomes disturbed by the local incursion of the local sensation of, say, thirst. And I call that more general feeling of balance the feeling of being alive. Okay? Without that feeling of homeodynamic equilibrium, there would be a kind of chasm between a purely unconscious sense of balance and then a conscious sense of imbalance that seems hard to cross. So, for example, once you finish drinking your water and your thirst dissipates, does your sense of the body disappear? No, still there. Once the pain of your running cramp subsides, does your sense of your body disappear? The answer I submit to you seems to be no, of course not. There's some pre-reflective background awareness of our own living bodies that gets disturbed by local homeodynamic incursions. So that means we need to have a sense of balance that lets us know when the action commanded by the local sensation has been successfully completed. They provide the subject with feedback about equilibrium. Right? Pains are core examples of such local perturbations arising within the phenomenological milieu of the lived body. Okay, this is a very quick set of arguments for the first premise. There's actually a whole battery of empirical data that I canvass in the published version of this paper that just came out. And there's, to my mind at least, really good empirical neuroscientific data that supports this premise as well. But I don't want to do neuroscience today, so we're not going to go through those arguments. But for the purposes of my discussion today, I'm going to take myself as having preliminarily established the reasonableness of this first premise, and we're going to move on, okay? Now we get to do the fun part. Here's where I can show my masochistic side, going back to Kat's talk. I love talking about dukkha. The Buddhist philosophers have been obsessed with this concept since the inception of Buddhism, and the word has so many different definitions, and they're all important, right? So the term can mean physical pain. It can mean just that. It can refer to something more robust like suffering. It also has this connotation of like unsatisfactoriness and stress. And the term shows up in different contexts, which then determine the meaning of the word in that context. And it's that plasticity of meaning that I think is important here. Okay, so here's a key passage. This is right back to ground zero, like Buddhism 101, right? The Buddha has achieved enlightenment. He comes back to his 5 ascetic companions, and he explains to them the 4 noble truths. And this is him explicating the first noble truth. He says, now, this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha, association with the unloved is dukkha, separation from the loved is dukkha, not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. Misery. So, this last clause in the passage that I've italicized, it doesn't seem to obviously follow from the list that precedes it. Everything before that last sentence is like, yep, this isn't fun, I don't like that either. Right? It's pretty clear. There's nothing too controversial about it. But then all of a sudden we get in this 5 clinging aggregates, and not only are those added to the list in a way that doesn't make immediate intuitive sense unless you're already familiar with Buddhist moral psychology, we also have this summary, like in short, as if this last sentence is meant to somehow summarize and contain everything that came before it, which is weird. It doesn't make immediate sense. And so commentators in this tradition had to do some legwork to unpack this and make sense of it. And what they did is they distinguished between 3 different levels of dukkha. Okay? The first one, aptly called dukkha. This is the dukkha of obvious stuff, right? The obvious things that we don't like. The dukkha of pain. It's occasional. We don't always have to deal with this kind of dukkha. It happens, but not all the time. Now, the examples from the list that we just saw in the last passage are things like physical pain, mental anguish, old age, sickness, death. This first level, notice, embraces both of what we might, from a contemporary psychological perspective, call physical pain and psychological suffering. And physical pain and psychological suffering both instantiate a kind here, dukkha, because they afflict those who undergo it. That's what they share. That's what makes them both subcategories of a single genus. So from a conventional point of view, this particular form of dukkha looks pretty exhaustive, okay? But there's still 2 more levels to go, right? We're just getting started. We're going to just drill down even further to my favorite form of dukkha. I have a favorite. Yeah. You know what they say? All research is me-search. So, this is called viparinama dukkha. This is the dukkha of change and impermanence. And the paradigm case here is being separated from the people that you love and united with the people that you can't stand. And we deal with this all the time. All the time, right? You have to go to the office and there's that person there whose face makes sounds. And when it does, agitation arises in the body, right? And you think, well, so you have to go to work and deal with this, right? And this is not fun, right? But it's okay because it's just a day at work, and then you get to go home, and maybe your pet there is you love your dog, or maybe your partner is there and you actually like them, or maybe you have a roommate who you actually like. So it's better. You get to go home and be united with the person that you care about. But then you have to go back to work the next day, right? But don't worry, it's the weekend. But then it's Monday. So we have a little cycle here, which the Buddhists call samsara, right? And This is meant to induce a kind of reflective moment, right? This rat race of enjoying the things in life that I enjoy and running away from the things I don't like is like a roller coaster of emotions and reactive attitudes. And the Buddhists want to say, look, this is a very profound form of dukkha that you should be aware of. And when you become aware of it, it's actually kind of a scary moment, right? Because you can start to become a bit disenfranchised, and the Buddhists talk about dispassion and disenfranchisement like it's a positive thing, but it can also seem a little nihilistic unless you have the right kind of understanding of what they're on about. Which leads us to the third form of dukkha. Once you start to recognize this roller coaster that you're on, we get to a subtler level of dukkha, which we call sankhara dukkha. Okay, actually, before I do sankhara dukkha, there's a really good quote that I want to read from Gomez. I'm just going to point now in the direction of a claim I'm going to make further substantial evidence for in the last part of the paper, but this kind of wide scope consideration of the inevitability of being coupled and decoupled from the things that you love and united with and then taken away from things that you hate, that this kind of inevitability, coupled with this third form of dukkha I'm about to unpack for you, provides a kind of hermeneutical lens, an interpretive framework through which the meaning and value of physical pain is interpreted by the subjects who experience it. So here's where Gomez wrote a brilliant paper on this back in the early 2000s comes in. He says, pain can be seen as something greater than a localized sensation of hurt, as a sensibility and a state of consciousness that overwhelms the whole person. Pain gives the whole person power over that hurt. What one does with pain can affect pain itself. And this is him sort of gesturing in the direction of how the Buddhist path of the cessation of suffering metabolizes pain properly and skillfully, which I'll say a little bit about at the end of the paper. But I'm going to mostly just dwell on the suffering and the misery for this paper. Okay, third form of suffering, sankhara dukkha. The dukkha of conditionality. This is the subtlest form of dukkha, the most pervasive. It's happening constantly, because it is tied up with that last sentence from the passage that we had a few slides ago. The 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. This is how the commentators draw the right connections that I was adverting to earlier. So this kind of dukkha is equated with the 5 clinging aggregates, and the point here is that there is a level at which we are constantly subjected to dukkha, because the very fabric of our psychophysical continuum is constantly perturbed, constantly bombarded with information to which we have evolved massively disequilibrating habits of reaction towards. Yeah? And that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance, a subtle agitation that is in the background and at the heart of most of our personalities. And that is the most important form of dukkha for my attempt to articulate a connection between this Buddhist soteriology on the one hand and this homeodynamic conception of pain on the other. And I hope that that connection is starting to become salient to you as we proceed. I'm going to continue to draw on this as we go. So very briefly, because I know this will be massive review for most of you, but just to really make it as clear as possible from the Buddhist perspective, why and precisely how you are all fundamentally agitated all the time. Your living experience is constituted for these Buddhists by 5 moving parts. This is the 5 aggregates. Rupa, physical form, the living sensitive body that is differentially sensitive through its sensory organs to different types of information. Feelings, the affective states that arise as a result of the living body systems being perturbed by the outer world. Sanya, the capacity of the mind to recognize, categorize, and otherwise sort the contents of experience according to different sorts of categories that we develop. Sankhara, the formations or reactive habits that develop as a result of these categories, giving us equivalence classes that are effectively charged that we then react to, thereby motivating and causing to arise consciousness, discernment, discrimination that puts us in a knowing relationship with the objects in the world that caused all this perturbation in the first place. this is an ongoing process. This is the basic Buddhist analysis of how perception works. And it's not fun. This is why they're all about cessation. Like, hey, what if all this were to stop? Wouldn't that be amazing? So this causal connectedness creates the subtle, constant, agitated dukkha, which is why the 5 aggregates affected by clinging are the final item in that list that I showed you earlier on that previous slide. Okay? I want to also note that this final sort of really subtle version of dukkha can be understood in the context of another very important discourse, my favorite discourse from the Pali Canon, the fire sermon, which is the third discourse the Buddha is purported to have given upon achieving awakening, where he basically says everything's on fire. And he's saying this to fire worshippers, right? So he's going to a group of people who worship fire, and he's like, you guys are right, but not quite right. He's like, fire is important. Why? Because everything, sabbe, all is burning. And what, bhikkhus, is the all that is burning? The I is burning. Forms are burning. I consciousness is burning. Eye contact is burning. Whatever Vedana, feelings arise with eye contact. Chakku phassa, as a condition, pachya, whether pleasant, painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of delusion, burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, I say. This guy's going to be a killer at parties. So, what's going on here, and why should you believe it? The image of fire here is used to characterize these basic processes of sensory information and representation. Why? Because all these types of burning that we've articulated in our previous analysis of this stratified conception of dukkha, the Buddha thinks these are all at work in even the most basic sensory cognitive functions of your organism. And the reason I think he wants to say this, and here I'm borrowing from previous analysis of the contemporary stuff about pain, is because the rat race of homeodynamic equilibrium never stops. Until you die, obviously, then it stops. But like that's not really something you look forward to, right? So the idea is that even just in the process of dealing with your thirst, in a moment where you realize, oh, I've been talking for a minute, I need to drink some water. That's your body giving you a death threat. Right? That's drink or else. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But really, there's a kind of background economy, an existential economy here. And here, I'm very, it's so cool when you meet people that you read their stuff and you're like, you know, you internalize it and you cite it in your work and you're like, oh, you're like that person. So Stephen Harris is here. I get to quote him now. He says that all samsaric experience is contaminated by anxiety and is unsatisfactory in being part of an impoverished system of pain. And further, I would add, the suffering that we experience in this process is not just explicit and obvious suffering, the dukkha, rather it is a pervasive and subtle form of suffering bound up with the organism's incessant need to self-regulate in order to survive. Okay. So that's what the Buddhists think about suffering. Now I'm going to transition back into the main argument, and I'm going to try and argue that the second and third premises are true. And then we'll derive the conclusion, and then I'll be quiet. We can have questions here. All right? Okay. So to carry out the argument for this premise, I need to talk a little bit about the intentionality of pain experience. Here, by intentionality, I don't mean the way in which you form an intention to do something. I mean the philosopher's technical definition of intentionality as the mind's directedness towards the world. Okay? And here I'm going to set up a disagreement between myself and my friend and colleague Colin Klein, and then on the basis of explaining why I win the fight about that disagreement, I will explicate this distinction between two species of intentionality that will then help us understand further the nature of pain experience. Okay, so one thing that Colin points out helpfully is that he takes pains to be uninformative. They don't really tell us anything about their causes. So here's Colin from his book. He says, Their pains are remarkably uninformative. Although the pain in my ankle motivates me, it gives me few clues as to why it's actually there. I know, of course, that I sprained my ankle and that the sprain causes my pain, but that is not information carried by the pain, however. I only know my ankle is sprained because I turned it in, and then the next day it looked like an angry grapefruit. And that's good evidence that I sprained it, but I could be wrong. My physician took the time to rule out alternative causes, and that was not an absurd thing to do. When I can't infer causes, I often have no idea why I'm feeling pain. So here there's this really cool idea that the sparsity of information about pain's causes is actually helps the pain discharge its functional role in an efficient way. Because when the pain tells me to protect some part of my body, I don't need to know why it hurts, I just need to get it done. That's the idea. Okay? I think this is an interesting claim as far as it goes, but I'm going to try and submit that it doesn't go far enough. Why? Well, look, the feeling of pain is not just a local sensation in some part of the body that requires protecting. It is also something that has happened to me as an embodied agent. And the holistic sense of self that is disturbed by the local perturbation gives us an avenue, I submit, into thinking about the intentional structure of pain in a more expansive way, one that makes the phenomenal character, or the experiential character of pain more informative than it can be under a more narrow construal of its intentional structure. So here I need to follow phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, who distinguish between two ways in which the mind can be intentionally directed towards its world. Object intentionality and horizontal intentionality, or sometimes Merleau-Ponty calls them act intentionality and operative intentionality. The idea here is something like the following, continuing on with the pain example. When we attend to a pain and note that it's uninformative with respect to its causes, we're taking kind of objective or act intentional attitude towards the pain. The pain is a local moment, place in the body, I'm paying attention to it. Why does it hurt? And then I go on an investigative process. But the pain is itself a local perturbation of a holistic bodily subject who is situated in a meaningful world. And this more holistic, horizontal, or operative intentionality is also at work in our pain experience. It gives context and meaning to the local experience. Let me say a bit more about this. When we're in pain, the world shows up for us as altered, as our action possibilities are limited by our pain. The actions commanded by a pain, the protective actions, for example, are there to protect that part of the body that needs to heal. But that kind of action, the protective action that a local pain commands, has a more holistic impact on the embodied subject's action potentials with respect to a world at large. Thus, even granting that the particular content of a pain doesn't tell us anything about what might have caused it, pains are still powerfully informative about our relation to the world. They're informative because they give us a sense of what's possible and thereby alter our sense of what is relevant and salient in the world around us. Okay, so much for my argument for the second premise. Third premise. Let's talk about suffering. To do this, I need to go into another domain of Buddhist philosophy. I'm going to look at some passages from Arya Deva's 400 verses and Chandrakirti's commentary on those. And I'm doing this because a lot of philosophers, as I mentioned at the very outset, they tend to be quite keen on strongly distinguishing between pain and suffering. And the key cases here in the contemporary landscape tend to be pain asymbolia cases, where there appears to be pain but not suffering. And we can also imagine cases where there's suffering without physical pain. So if psychological suffering and physical pain are doubly dissociable, then one can't constitute the other. They're just distinct phenomena, right? And Klein, on a similar note, will claim something like the following, that suffering is not a feature of pain, but a response to it. This means that suffering is only contingently connected to pain, and hence that pains only contingently hurt or feel bad. Okay, so 2 responses to this. First will be brief, the second one I'm going to kind of spend some time on. First, the Buddhist philosophers we've looked at would deny that pains only contingently hurt. Instead, they're going to say that it's actually perfectly consistent to say that a painful bodily feeling hurts, but that doesn't cause something like psychological pain. The Buddhists want to distinguish between physical pain, which they'll call, let's say, little d dukkha, and psychological stress or upset, domanassa. So the move from pain to hurt to suffering in Klein's response is a bit rushed. So that's kind of some bookkeeping, not all that convincing. But what the second reply I have here is a bit more interesting. So Klein here says something really interesting and I think true. And I want to dwell on this and unpack it a bit. So he says, homeostatic demands can't be put off indefinitely. Hunger signifies a state that needs to be resolved sooner or later on pain of death. Few demands will thus outrank severe hunger for the obvious reason that most other things you might want require being alive to get. Whatever your other desires then, the homeostatic sensations must remain non-optional parts of the motivational milieu. So when we feel pangs of hunger, we don't just experience a command to eat, we experience a command to eat or else. Klein is just right here, that the motivational primes of homeodynamic feelings command on pain of death. And that's true for everyone all the time. It just so happens we've built for ourselves collectively a form of life where we don't often have to experience that. It doesn't escalate to that point. We're usually pretty capable of dealing with those commands in short order. But if I didn't have this water bottle and I didn't have access to a potable liquid, within 72 hours I would expire. I'm almost out, actually. So, how much longer do I have? I meant the talk, not my lecture. Okay, so this mortality constraint, as I'll call it, on meeting the commands of homeodynamic imperatives is part of what gives them such motivational force, non-optional motivational force, as Klein calls it. Even when the feelings in their initial upshot in our cognitive emotional economy are non-life threatening. But we know in the feeling of those feelings that they will be or could be life-threatening if we don't attend to them eventually. This pervasive mortality awareness, tacit as it is, creates a radical existential context within which the commands of local feelings, including pains, are understood and obeyed. It is this existential context, I submit, that prevents us from keeping pain and suffering distinct. The inevitability of death and the constant fight to self-regulate successfully in order to prevent death is a powerful form of suffering. Buddhist philosophers believe this suffering is pervasive. And if that is right, then all pain is experienced in the context of an existential form of suffering, one that provides meaning to that pain and motivational force to its commands. In this part of the paper, I'm going to build on the insights of the second part by reconstructing a few arguments from Chandrakirti's commentary on Adyadeva's 400 verses. This chapter from Adyadeva constitutes a prolonged philosophical meditation on the relationship between pleasure and pain, and the way this relation instantiates a kind of pervasive suffering proper to all sentient beings. Now, Buddhists are not widely touted for their positive attitudes towards the body. In this way, in spite of all kinds of forms of Buddhist modernism, they remain decidedly ancient in their orientation towards lived experience. So here's Adyadeva. He says, these two, valuing the body and valuing an enemy, are seen to be similar. Not all that helpful, a little terse, but Chandrakirti's commentary is helpful here. He says, during the hot season in the middle of the day, a man slept comfortably in a chariot. The king saw him by chance and took pity on him. Later, when this man was reclining on soft cushions, he could not sleep because a single mustard seed had touched him. It is just like this when someone is brought up with the greatest comforts. The more the body is indulged with pleasure's prerequisites, the more it becomes a vessel for pain. I can't help but just think of like the temper tantrums I've seen in Starbucks. Right, like that's what they're talking about, right? Like the more you have, the easier it is to get agitated, right? It's like, you used 2% milk in my latte. Unacceptable. Right? A single mustard seed. We all have our hang-ups like this, right? And the Buddhist, Chandrakirti's point here is that the mind, its propensity to interpret the meaning of discomfort evolves with its conditions, and that we can become highly reactive, even as we enjoy the comforts of life. and maybe especially when we enjoy the comforts of life in an unreflective way. So we're asked then to consider the kinds of attitudes we adopt in interpreting and reacting to unpleasant sensations that arise at different stages of life. And these attitudes are inseparable from our experiences of pain. And for this reason, again, quoting Gomez, who rightly notes that one may be tempted to dismiss some of the Buddhist reflections on pain as overlooking the apparently fundamental difference between pain and suffering. But one may also propose that the averred confusion is in fact a statement regarding the role of suffering in the processing of pain. Could not have said it better. It's really on point here. So the salient point here is that our capacity to feel pain does not arise simply as a matter of impersonal biological facts about how the body self-regulates. The body is also a living subject who is situated in a cultural and historical context that provides a hermeneutical architecture for how pain is felt when it arises. And our habit of transforming pain or discomfort into suffering is deeply entrenched. Thus, the question of differentiating them becomes more complicated in light of the psychological dynamics that go into our capacity to feel in the first place. And this point comes out nicely in some recent work on chronic pain that I'm going to cite to you very briefly. Svenius argues that, first and foremost, pain appears to be a kind of signal of distress. It hurts, do something about it, stop moving, go to the doctor, etc. But pain can nevertheless, in its more penetrating and chronic forms, develop into something which permeates our entire experience. Pain, in these forms, determines what can possibly appear for us in the world around us and in the ways it does so. Adams then says that there's actually a kind of paradox inherent in this. Adams argues that pain creates a paradox for rational agents. Pain is on the one hand something vital, keeping us robust in the face of the world. People who don't feel pain, they die. They die real fast. Right? Pain is important. It plays a really important role in our lives for this reason. Right? It keeps us robust in the face of a world that's eventually going to kill us. But it is also a way in which the world ends up killing us. Right? It's the thing that helps us stave off death, and it's actually the thing that happens to us when we die, right? Like some people, if you get enough medicine, you can die a painless death. But not to put too fine a point on it, but most of you are going to experience horrible pain and then die. We laugh. It's this is just life, right? So it's what it is. Getting old, that's your best case scenario is your body just slowly decays. Right? This is why really elderly people are a bit hunched over, because they're the force of gravity just crushing you into the ground, and you're not strong enough to stay straight anymore. That's just, right? You shrink. The space between your vertebra just compresses as you age, which is why you get shorter, and then eventually you just seize and fall over and decay. I never understood why these people think this is funny. Every time I tell this, people laugh, and I'm like, no, this is what's going to happen. This is best. This is if you don't get hit by a bus tomorrow. Right? This is best case scenario. And this is actually hard to understand. Maybe that's why we laugh about it, right? So here's Adams. Why is this a paradox? Paradoxically, the very worst pain and suffering is what most cries out to be made sense of, and the very worst pain and suffering is what stumps, stalemates, or destroys our capacity to make positive sense of anything at all. So pain is not only something that complicates the plot of the story of our lives, it is a central guiding element to the plot. Pain isn't just a piece of the plot, it shapes the very way in which events unfold and helps provide meaning to those events. Our Buddhist philosophers take this point even further in the final section here, which I'll briefly go through, where we expand our analysis to the whole lifetime. So here's a passage from Aryadeva. He says, as time passes, pain increases. Consequently, pleasure is experienced as alien to the body. Now this inference to the consequent here, we could poke some holes in this argument. But I think what's important here is the antecedent conditional of this inference, which is that as you get older, it hurts more. Right? So one day, you will wake up and it will hurt to have knees. And you will go to the doctor and say, my knees hurt. And they'll be like, that's your life now. You can stretch a bit, but that's just what it is. Right? Oh, my lower back hurts. Welcome to your 40s. Good luck with the second half. right? That's really what it is. And I think that's part of what they're talking about here, right? Is that the aging process works in this way, that pain is actually a really concrete marker. The increased prevalence of pain is a concrete marker in the architecture of the time of your life. So here's Chandrakirti. He says, as the body matures during childhood, adolescence, and adulthood and old age, we see an increase of pain, but not of pleasure. Pleasure retreats into the background as the body matures and pain comes into the foreground. Consequently, we see that pain alone belongs to the body and pleasure is alien. Now again, I think this is way too strong. There are other things that make life worth living, especially as you get older, right? Like if you get old, as you get older, I mean, I've found this. I'm like middle-aged at this point. I'm just less agitated than I was in my 20s. That's a boon. Like I'm like, okay, I'm not as much of it. I'm still an idiot, but I'm not like a total fool anymore. That's a benefit. Like I'm glad for that, right? Like I'll take a death for that, right? It's fine. So I don't agree with Chandrakirti here fully, but his expansion of this gloss is very poignant, and I do agree with what he says here. He says, day after day, the pain of exhaustion and the anxiety over the journey's diminishing provisions becomes more acute for the traveler on a long road. And similarly, the longer foolish ordinary people live, the more they acquire the pains of old age and move closer to death. So here's how I want to interpret these passages. How am I doing? I'm almost done. Physical pain has long-term psychological consequences that structure our conception of what it is and how it conditions our experience. It's not just something that commands us to protect a part of our body. It's an irreducible component of the phenomenology of our time consciousness and our understanding of what it means to live a life. And its increased prevalence over the course of a lifetime is a core component of the aging process and the meaning of our lives. And these wide-scope points about the prevalence of pain to the psychological and existential predicaments of aging and death suggest that pain is constitutive of this existential suffering I've been talking about. Which is why I want to conclude here that my third premise of my argument is true, and therefore my conclusion follows, that pains have a horizontal intentionality and are partially constitutive of existential suffering. Feeling pain provides us with a meaningful, robust, and holistic intentional relationship to our world, and through being intentionally directed to the world in a painful way, we endure existential suffering. What it is to suffer is to live a lifetime fraught with pain. And in conclusion, I want to say the following, and then I'll stop and we'll do some questions. I haven't said anything about the solution, right? Buddhist philosophers think there's a solution to the problem of suffering, but they also maintain that physical pain remains for liberated beings. So does this mean that Buddhists must hold against my view that pain is not constitutive of existential suffering? I'm going to suggest very briefly, no. Here's why. There's a really interesting discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya called the Donna Sutta. And in this sutta, the Brahmin Donna, he's following the Buddha around and he notices that the Buddha has 1,000-spoked wheels in his footprints. And he's like, wow, this guy's neat. He's got 1,000-spoked wheels in his footprints. I'm going to talk to this guy. And when the Donna asks the Buddha about what he is and what he might become in the next life, the Buddha denies that he's any number of things. He denies being a human being, for example. And he instead claims I should be remembered only as an awakened one. And the relevant point here I want to suggest very briefly is the following. That what it takes to achieve freedom from existential misery is to transform oneself into another kind of being altogether, to completely remake one's cognitive emotional economy. And that this makes the dissociation of physical pain and suffering not so much an issue of conceptual analysis, but radical existential transformation. And the reason that distinction matters is that in the ordinary human case, physical pain is constitutive of what it means to suffer. Thank you.
Thank you for the talks. I appreciate them. This is a question for the first talk. Professor Pruitt. I had a question about, my concern was, so I agree with your kind of critique of homeostasis. I like the allostasis. My concern with allostasis is there's an underlying functionalism that's still at play. By that I mean, it seems like by pains being commands, they're still serving some ultimate purpose for the organism. And I'm kind of questioning, I want to kind of question if that's always the case. are pains really always commands? Are they actually always doing something? Sean had brought that up in his last talk, and then a side comment maybe is like maybe that they're not always imperative. Maybe I'm conflating multiple things here, but that's the question. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So Sean, yes, very nicely said that he's happy to be a pluralist about pain. I'm generally less satisfied with pluralisms, but because of that, very much more likely to try to give a really precise definition of what something is. I fully recognize that I'm using pain in a highly technical way. And even the way that I have a very strong distinction between pain and suffering is something that oftentimes we use pain when we're talking about what would be suffering in my way of describing these phenomena. So I, for the moment at least, am sort of defining what I'm talking about with pain in terms of having imperative content. If there are good arguments for why pain is also other things that don't mix them up with arguments about the affective aspects of what we normally call pain, then I would like to share them. But for now, that's where I'm at. On the functionalism piece, going along with the idea that I think the most compelling accounts of pain are imperativist accounts. Yes, pain is going to play some kind of role in the constitution of an organism. I think that this is actually what's very distinctive about pain, following Abhinavagupta, that pain is precisely that instability and movement that pushes an organism to embody itself in a particular kind of way in a world. So yeah, I would, if that's functionalist, I would bite that bullet. I think functionalism as a paradigm is very tightly linked to a bunch of other metaphysical and ontological assumptions that I wouldn't share coming out of these traditions, so I would leave that a bit aside.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have a question for you, Sean. And it's a simple question. What is the theory of trauma? Given the dark picture of humans that you paint, is there room for a theory of trauma, or has all existence become traumatic? The reason I'm led to this question is because in the continental tradition in which I work, trauma is an exceptional form of experience that in some way intrudes on experience and then reconfigures experience. And I'm wondering if there's room for that notion in what you're saying.
There better be, right? It would be a deficiency, a massive explanatory deficiency of my account if there wasn't. So I would be inclined to locate things like trauma in what I would call the first level of dukkha, right? The dukkha, right? So the Buddhists do want to acknowledge that there are some things that are just truly awful. There are, the Pali Canon, which is sort of the one that I kind of really sort of lean into. There are all kinds of, horrible stories that provide the motivational background for people renouncing and becoming highly realized monastics. So I think the Buddhists are very much alive to that. I think because and maybe this is a deficit of my talk and not emphasizing the solution part more, because they're very solution-oriented thinkers, they're always going to try and reduce or at least explain the psychological dynamics that underwrite any given large-level traumatic event, because for them at least they think this is where you can get free, is by dealing with your own reactive attitudes towards what's happening. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, they do have a role for this. And it is thematized in different strands of the literature in different ways, which we can talk about later. But yeah, I do think they have room for that, and that it's important, and it's a good question. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. Thank you for 3 exciting talks. I'm a cognitive scientist primarily by training, so I have a long list of questions and things I want to talk about. But I'll just do a general one, mainly perhaps for the first 2 talks. So being a cognitive scientist is of course very nice to suddenly see Buddhist philosophy presented in a language that I understand and suddenly feels very familiar and not that complicated at all, because I know some of these theories. But it reminded me a little bit of some of the early translations of Chinese philosophy made by Christians into that framework. And so the question really is based on your just experience with having to combine these two ways of thinking that seem to also be very different. Of course, the modern cognitive theories come with associations and assumptions and even maybe metaphysics and so on. How easy is it to translate? And is there a risk of distorting the original text by doing this? And do we notice if we distort it and so on?
Yes, there is an enormous risk, and it's very hard to do well. I certainly don't claim to have mastered this skill. The approach, at least, that I tend to take is, first off, my own background is I'm grounded in the Sanskrit texts. And so I'm pretty confident in things like my understanding of Upaladeva and Abhinavagupta on pain. The extent to which that then communicates with other things that are happening in the contemporary academy, including in the cognitive sciences, is something that then I try to figure out based on the arguments and based on where the holes are in the arguments, and then just see where the different theories can help push each other. It's very, very, very easy to have just fundamental miscommunications and mistranslations in this. And even at the break, a couple of different people were like, how did you go from physical bodies to social bodies? And I'm like, well, the metaphysics that I'm using doesn't really have a problem with that. But then it's like, I have to be much clearer about that, given that the metaphysics of the contemporary cognitive science does have a problem with that. So I think it's a lot about clarity and making sure that you're either a specialist in or talking to specialists too in the areas that you're working in.
I'll be brief, but I would note that also, there's just a huge amount of literature on this, and really smart people have thought about it very, very carefully, right? There's an entire branch of cognitive science called enactive cognitive science, which takes its explicit motivations from interpretations of Buddhist philosophy. And most of Buddhist modernism in the late 19th and early 20th century explicitly articulates itself with the language of Western science to push back against Christian colonialists. So this sort of cross-pollinization of Western science and Buddhist thinking is just sort of part of the 20th century, right? It's just, and so there are, I think, better and worse ways to engage in that discussion. But I would say, this is like 150 years of thinking and cultural evolution happening, and we just have to do our best to roll with that. Yeah.
It's on. I thank you guys for an exciting panel, and there could be a version of this probably directed at any of you, but I started thinking of it with Kat's talk just because we read some of the same stuff. So, so you talked to, kind of made your groundwork on individual bodily pain and then extended it to communal pain. So my question, in brief, is can you recap the Pratibhijna account of pain? And what I really want to ask is, are you able to extend that account to deal with sort of pain at the sudden unexpected loss of a loved one, or something like that, like pains that are not physical bodily pain?
Thanks. So there's the question. So for Pratibhijna thinkers, it is not the case that any level of embodiment is either completely defined by consciousness nor completely exclusive of consciousness. What it is to exist in a world is to have an intentional, as Sean brought up, the sense of intentionality of being like a subject in here looking out at a world out there. That relationship is possible because it's one of exclusion. It's one where there's an underlying reality that grounds both the subject and the object side aspects of that world. That underlying reality is referred to as consciousness, because consciousness has the potential to take the form of what it is not without losing its own identity. This is the idea that it's perfectly possible for me right now to imagine a rock, and the rock is nothing but my imagination, and yet the rock is insentient. Consciousness is said to be able to do this in a way that physical matter is not, so consciousness is slightly more fundamental. But then that doesn't mean that subjectivity is more fundamental. Like, both subjectivity and objectivity are equally aspects of consciousness that are formed by excluding each other. So if you kind of roll with that basic understanding of what reality is like, then it helps us see how being an embodied agent is inclusive of what we normally think of as both physical and psychological mental factors, and being a world out there is also inclusive of forms of agency. So because there's not this strong sense to begin with of a division between a physical body and then an agent that's somewhere, and then a world out there that's other agents maybe and physical stuff, then there's a greater capacity to have fluidity between different agentive scales, just on the basis of how exclusion classes are manipulated. So that's why it's possible to shift these scales. And so then the participation account of pain points to the idea that the reason why any particular level would be set or broken is because existing in a world is always an active process of creative adaptation. So to be a subject in a world, because that is something that's just formed by exclusion, is something that's reformed moment by moment by moment by moment. Pain is what's telling us that there's this constant process of establishing our boundaries, and tapping into pain's command, if we're able to see it clearly enough, can help us realize that we can fashion our boundaries in a lot of different ways. And even those boundaries can be fashioned in ways that explicitly acknowledge the larger communal aspects of our experience. They can even be fashioned in ways for Abhinavagupta that go all the way to the point of reaching liberation, with many, many stops in between.
Thank you. This is a question for Professor. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. It's a question for Professor Wondron, and it's a relatively narrow question. In one of the steps of your paper, you were talking about the notion of seeds. You used the concept seeds, and I was wondering how important or central, how robust it is. Concretely, were you in these quotations, the uncommon is the seed of the individual sense spheres, the common is the seed of the shared world. What work is seed doing there? I'm interested in this because of my own interest in the work that seed is doing in other texts, so I was wondering if there is something that you could just explain more, expand.
Sure. The seed is a metaphor for the potentiality of karma, of potentiality of the results of one's actions to come into effect. And it is a metaphor that the Yogacharans make a lot of use of, but we also see it in, for example, the Abhidharma Kosha of Subandhu, and there are passages that are in the Pali Canon that also use seed as a metaphor. It's easy to substantialize this as a metaphor, but what but if we sort of unpack it as a signifier of karmic theory, I think it helps us to understand it better. Actions have a certain kinds of results. Those results do not always occur immediately after those actions, and so the lag between when those actions occur and when the results come into fruition, to use another metaphor, or when they mature, there's a gap. And that gap is described as, by Yogacharans, as a seed. Other schools talk about that gap between actions and their result, and they don't use the metaphor of seeds, but they just talk about potentialities. Karma upachaya, the sort of a gathering of karmic karma that's going to come into fruition at a certain time. And so in more systematic Abhidharmic and Yogacara systems, things are categorized in terms of whether they are result or whether they are cause. So in the three categories, in which the 12 links were put into, the three parts, action, their results, and then there are afflictive reactions. That part of results are results of previous actions. So between the actions and those results, you could call that seeds. And so part of what karmic theory is, and it took me probably a lot of time to sort of think through a lot of what they're talking about, but the category of results are things that happen all the time. Consciousness, or cognitive awareness, anyway, vijnana, is a result of previous actions. And other kinds of things, the feelings, the sensations, are results. And so from that point of view, results are constantly coming into being, sort of moment by moment by moment, in the same way that the potentiality for results are constantly being generated with every moment of intentionality. So in a certain kind of way, our whole lives are sort of revolved around actions and their results, and then the interim in between them. And so it's a shorthand really for karma theory. And it's very easy in the Yogacara tradition. We talk about seeds stored in the storehouse consciousness or put into the storehouse consciousness. These are very concrete metaphors and easy to reify. But if we sort of unpack them into the vocabulary, the syntax of dependent arising and karmic theory, things occur with certain kinds of conditions, results happen due to causes and conditions, then we can see that this tendency to reify is a misreading, really, because these are just metaphors. And the Samdhina actually talks about Samdhina Sutra, the Yogacara Sutra, as it were, from the 3rd to 5th century, talks about misreading metaphors and misreading things that should be, in effect, described in terms of dependent arising that, in fact, get described in terms of the Parlikapa Svabhava or Svalakshana. That is, we read them as if they were these entities or these essences. And so reading a seed as stored in some container that in a certain sense doesn't change is actually reading the dependent nature, that things occur through dependent arising in terms of falsely imagined entities. We do this all the time with metaphors. We reify them, and with other things as well. Yeah.
I just have a figure on this I want to ask you about, because it builds directly on Martina's question, which is, so if the storehouse consciousness is the sort of receptacle for all of these bija, these seeds, and you refer to it many times as an unconscious, but it's a vijnana, right? Like it's literally called vijnana, which we mostly translate as conscious. So how can a vijnana be unconscious? Like, in what sense is it unconscious if it's a moment of consciousness? I never understood that. It's not a deficiency of your account, it's just a deficiency in my understanding of what they're up to.
Actually, I don't like the translation of vijnana as consciousness, to tell you the truth. I prefer a sort of an ugly English phrase, cognitive awareness, because vijnana is aware of discrete objects from moment to moment. This is both early Buddhism and Abhidharma and Yogacara, and then arises with certain kinds of causes and conditions. It's a resultant factor, and it's an awareness of something. And in that sense, it's kind of an intentional awareness. So the question here is much like what we would ask about subliminal awareness. Does subliminal awareness happen, right? Can we talk intelligibly about kind of operating in a world that is not totally accessible to our conscious awareness. Is that like a rock, or is that sort of some type of response at a level below the threshold of awareness, which is what subliminal means, below the threshold, in which still processes are going on. And so in a way, I think part of this is the semantics of the term conscious and the semantics of the English, which gets back to your question about translation. And yeah, I don't know if that puts...
We're having dinner, it's fine.
All right,
I think it's good to think of it as subliminal awareness, and whether or not we think that's intelligible.
So this is actually a question that was sparked by the title of Kat's paper, although I really appreciated all 3 pictures, they were amazing. But when we talk about collective suffering, there seems to be a form of suffering that goes beyond the individual physical suffering and the ones that we went through here. So as an example, I can think of the fire in Lahaina last year. You guys heard about some last night. And that seems to have caused a level of suffering within the community that goes beyond the individuals who suffered physical pain, those who lost loved ones or property, but seem to be a suffering for the community as a whole. And I'm very curious from your different perspectives what that sort of non-localized suffering would be addressed by the Buddhist and other perspectives.
So my thought on this goes along with the idea that our senses of subjectivity, our senses of agency, are not ever things that are fixed or given, and neither are the worlds in relation to which those senses of subjectivity are formed, and that changes in the major changes in different types of events, either within one's own oneself or in one's world, can sometimes knock us into different ways of parsing what we ignore in the both subjective and objective aspects that shape our experience. Technically, I would say that individual agents are grounded by subsumption in collective agents, which would mean that they're not reducible the collective agencies are not reducible to a mere sum of individual agents, but at the same time, individual agents are aspects of collective agents. I probably should have tried to get into some of those technicalities here, but I ran out of time.
I could respond to that as well. Vasubandhu, in his commentary to the Dharma Vibhaga, which I've read fairly carefully, says in 2 different places that we should not interpret this notion of a shared world as the same thing as a shared consciousness. So the example that occurs to me is a lot of people around the world watch the World Cup, but we are all experiencing it individually. I think it's Rang So So is the Tibetan for that. It's not in Sanskrit. And so in a sense, what he's saying is the shared aspect is that we are sharing things that are very similar, but even what appear to be the same to all of us, whether that's a phone or a bag or whatever, we experience them differently depending upon the whole set of predispositions and schemas that we have. And so in that sense, he's preserving this sense of individuals and individual mind stream that sort of courses through samsara, though we share these worlds together and have all of these common assumptions, etc.
I was saying I very much appreciate in your talk the way you've entangled pain and suffering in a way that makes it very difficult to separate them. And I think that has implications for whether you can actually make a distinction between the first, second, and third level. It seems to me that's at least part of what is a corollary of what you're doing. My question then is, if pain is something that is not able to be eradicated, in fact will increase, and suffering and pain are entangled at all levels, then is it at all possible to overcome suffering?
Yeah. Let me say more. There's a reason why I just tried to like conclude with it. I was just like, yeah, sort of, maybe, yeah. It's the Buddhist path, as far as I can understand it, if you take seriously the problem of suffering, its eradication looks huge, right? It looks almost asymptotic at times, I think. Yeah. So. I think it is possible to overcome suffering, and what I was trying to gesture at in talking very briefly about the discourse between the Buddha and Donna at the end of the talk was that what it would take to achieve it is something far more profound than I think a lot of Buddhist modernism recognizes. Right? So there's a lot of discourse around whether or not we should be angry, right? So you've got a lot of Buddhist and neo-Stoics saying like, oh, let's just do away with anger. I'm like, good luck with that. That's a fantastic goal. Like, I don't see it happening anytime soon. So to me, I think it's possible. Like, I want there to be modal space in the world I'm trying to articulate here. But I think what it would take to step into that is to become something quite otherwise than human, in core cognitive, emotional, reactive sense of that term, in terms of how your cells and your basic sensory and cognitive apparatus processes meaning and value, that needs to be completely upended and transformed. And that if you can achieve that, then you can overcome suffering. But it comes with great cost. Right? There's a discourse in the canon where the Buddha says, if bandits were to kidnap you and with rusty saws dismember you slowly, and you were to in your heart generate even a trace of resentment towards them, you would not have understood my teaching. That's insane. Right? That's like, right? Like, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's inhumane. In a very literal sense of the term, I would argue. Similarly, like the admonitions against grief, right? It's just like you're crying when your beloved teacher dies, wussy stuff. We don't do that here. You haven't worked hard enough, right? That's part of it, right? So I think it's possible. I think it carries a huge cost. And I think part of that cost is that you become something quite different, which is how I tried, and maybe I'm not sure if I was fully successful, to kind of hold the line between saying on the one hand that feeling pain is constitutive of a form of existential suffering, but still you can overcome it. But what it would cost you to do so is something quite radical. That's all I have to say about that.
Last question we have.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Krishna from Delhi University. You people have been wonderful in your presentations. I particularly like William's lucid presentation on Vasubandhu. I have a number of questions, but I'll ask only two. One to Kate. Kate, you have mentioned Rajas Guna. That is, of course, the Guna that has been mentioned in Sankhya and also Srimad Bhagavad Gita. My particular question to you is, what is the role of Purusha, right, in receiving or distancing pain, because Rajas Guna is the Guna or property of Prakriti, the material reality, right? So this is the question to you. Okay, let me ask the second question that is directed to William. William, I mean, it's interesting, you have given an example of, taking coffee or not taking coffee, right? You have mentioned karma, you have mentioned, alay and all. If you follow the theory of momentariness, the change, then the X who is taking the coffee is no more the X, right? The coffee is no more the same coffee. The trauma is no more the same trauma. The suffering is no more the same suffering. Where is the continuity of what we are talking about if we take the Buddhist perspective? Is there any eternal entity continuing over time which makes the process of cognitive awareness complete? This is my question to you. I mean, your reflections are welcome, so thank you so much. Maybe because I'm the only one, the last one asking this question, so I'll ask my question to you maybe after this session. So sorry not asking the question out right now. Thank you so much.
So on Rajas and Purusha. Yeah. So in the history of how classical Samkhya was adopted and adapted by different traditions in the many centuries that were between the Samkhya Parikai and then Abhinava writing in Kashmir, one of the things that tended to get changed a lot was the articulation of the relationship between Prakriti and Purusha, and then whether or not Prakriti and Purusha represented distinct realities, the only realities, things along those lines. For Abhinavagupta and his tradition, Purusha became the, not like the holder of a bundle, but there are these things called the kanchukas in the Pratibhijna Tattvas, which Tarella translates as the curiouses. It's a great translation. These are sort of like the exoskeletons that serve to delimit and hold together consciousness to appear as an individual embodied entity. And it's these kanchukas which then actually constitute Purusha, and then Purusha is further entangled with Prakriti, with material, empirical reality, after sort of the delimitation of consciousness has formed it. So the picture of Purusha itself is very different, and so, yeah.
As for the question about continuity, one of the favored metaphors is a burning candle. And the flame is constantly changing. It's constantly burning fuel, oxygen, etc. And yet it is persisting from moment to moment to moment, dependent upon the persistence of similar causes and conditions. And so the Buddhists would say there is no need for some type of eternal entity underlying that. It is sufficient to account for continuity by the continuity of causes and conditions.
But the candle itself is not self-aware. What is happening with the process of burning?
This seems to be a question about the coherence of experience, perhaps?
Even the candle is not experiencing anything.
Right, so how can there be self-awareness? I think a simple metaphor here is we talk about the body healing itself. And when we say the body heals itself, we understand that the body is made up of various kinds of systems that interact in various ways. And at least the Yogacharans, most certainly, but a lot of the other Indian traditions would say that the mind is a name, a designation for sets of processes that can interact and be aware of other sets of processes. It's not a singular entity that we should reify, even though that is what our dispositions are to do when we have single words that we think refer to single things. It's just a designation for sets of processes. And we can be one part of our, from the cognitive science point of view, it's not that hard. Certain parts of the brain interact with and monitor and regulate other parts of the brain, including awareness of other kinds of things. And these can be impaired and injured, and these certain kinds of processes can no longer function. So self-awareness is a complex cognitive process, not a fundament of reality from this school's point of view.
Thanks, everybody.